Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. In the heart of New York, a man hears footsteps from an apartment that's been vacant for over a decade. A woman once died there, doors locked from the inside, no killer ever found. But when he finds hidden tapes whispering his own name, the silence above turns into a nightmare below. What if the killer never left? And worse, what if he's next? New York never slept, but there were moments when it slowed down, deep in the night, when even the taxis stopped honking and the steam vents only hissed gently. In that sliver of stillness, when the city exhaled and darkness crept through the cracks, something else stirred. In apartment 5C, tucked between layers of ancient brick and thin drywall, a man sat alone on his worn sofa, cradling a lukewarm mug of coffee, his eyes unfocused and heavy. He couldn't say exactly when he'd started noticing it. Maybe it was always there, hidden behind the hum of the refrigerator or the distant sirens. But now it was clear. Footsteps. From the apartment above his. Not footsteps like pacing or someone moving furniture. No, this was different. These were slow, careful steps, like bare feet gliding across hardwood in the middle of the night. They always started around 3 a.m., soft at first, then growing louder, circling a fixed path directly above his living room. Sometimes they paused, hovering over one spot as if the person had stopped to listen. The ceiling creaked under the weight, but nothing ever fell, no thud or voice. Just steps. Then silence. The building was old. Pre-war, with creaky floors and cracked crown molding that had seen better decades. It wasn't unusual to hear sounds from the neighbors, water pipes, occasional arguments, the soft buzz of a television left on too long. But the apartment above had been vacant since before he moved in. The landlord had mentioned it during the lease signing. Unit 6C's been empty for years. Water damage. We keep it sealed. And yet, those footsteps continued, almost every night. Always around 3. He tried to ignore them at first, brushing it off as plumbing, maybe an animal. Rats, perhaps. But rats didn't move like that. They didn't stop and start again. They didn't follow his routine. One night, after hearing the familiar steps, he crept quietly into his kitchen, lights off, and stood perfectly still. The ceiling groaned gently above him. He glanced up, heart ticking a little faster, and there it was, the sound of movement directly overhead, crossing slowly from one side of the ceiling to the other. Then it stopped right above him. Not a sound. Just stillness. He didn't breathe. Then a single creak. And another, closer to the wall. Like someone was pressing their ear to the floor, listening. The next morning, he asked the super again. "Are you sure no one's living up there?" "Yeah," the old man answered, barely looking up from the clipboard. "Place has been sealed 12 years. Cops used to come around about it, back when," he trailed off, noticing the question in the air. "Back when what?" he asked. The super waved it off. "Some lady died up there. Locked herself in. No sign of forced entry. Weird case. I don't know the whole thing, I wasn't working here then." He didn't ask again, but the footsteps felt heavier after that. As if knowing he now knew. He bought earplugs. They didn't help. He played music while he slept, but the footsteps slipped through anyway. Sometimes he'd wake up and realize the music had stopped for no reason. The player still plugged in. Power still on. Just silent. Once, in the haze between sleep and waking, he thought he heard crying. Soft, almost whispered. A woman's voice, fragile and distant, floating down through the ceiling vent in his bedroom. He lay there, staring up at the dark square in the wall, waiting for the sound again. It didn't return that night. But the next night, it did. And the one after that. He started sleeping on the couch, keeping the bedroom door closed. Not that it made much difference. The sounds knew where he went. Sometimes the footsteps followed him from room to room. Sometimes they were already waiting when he entered. He Googled the address, hoping for a clue. One article came up, local archive, badly formatted. Body found in locked apartment. No name. No suspect. Just that the woman had called the police 3 times in the week before her death. Said someone was watching her. Following her. They never found anyone. The article mentioned she was found near her bed. No signs of trauma. No drugs. Just dead. The door had been locked from the inside. Window sealed. No way in, no way out. He stared at the article until the screen blurred. 12 years ago. He checked the date. Same week as today. Same month. She died this week, 12 years ago. And now, suddenly, the footsteps had started again. Maybe it was a coincidence. An old building groaning with age. A trick of acoustics. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That somehow, his presence had stirred something loose. Something that had waited in the walls all this time. And whatever it was, it had just begun to move again. He tried to move on like nothing was wrong. Told himself the brain could invent sounds in the silence, that anxiety could play tricks, that being alone in a big city just made people paranoid. But those thoughts didn't last. Especially not after the scratching began. At first, it was subtle, like a shifting sound inside the wall near the radiator. Then it grew sharper, more deliberate. Not random, not rodents. Scratching in long, deliberate drags, then a pause, then again. Sometimes it came from the bedroom vent, sometimes from under the floor. Once, while brushing his teeth, he heard it coming from behind the bathroom mirror. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He called the landlord the next morning, asking again about 6C. Got the same answer. Vacant. Sealed. Unsafe. But now he asked more directly. Was it possible someone had broken in? Squatters, maybe? Could someone have crawled in through another part of the building? The landlord sighed through the phone. There's no way in. We boarded that unit from the inside. Only way to open it is from the hallway, and the locks are original. Deadbolt, security bar. Hasn't been touched since the incident. I swear, kid, no one's living there. He wanted to believe him. But the sounds only got worse. One night, as he lay wide-eyed in bed, the footsteps returned with more intensity, heavier, faster. They moved in bursts now, circling, stopping, then starting again. Then came the crying again, but closer. Not muffled like before. It was clearer, sharp and gasping, like someone hiding and trying not to be heard. He turned up his fan to drown it out. It didn't help. By the third week, he stopped inviting anyone over. Friends noticed he looked tired, jumpy, thinner. He couldn't explain why he was always distracted, why he kept glancing up at the ceiling mid-conversation. He avoided their questions, smiled it off, made excuses about work or lack of sleep. He didn't want to sound crazy. He didn't want to say he was afraid of an apartment no one lived in. One evening, after returning home late from a diner downtown, he noticed something strange. A fine layer of dust across the kitchen counter. His place was always clean, he was meticulous, almost obsessive. But this wasn't ordinary dust. It was gray, dry, powdery, like crumbled plaster. It had settled in a straight line, as if something had been dragged along the ceiling and disturbed the old cracks. He looked up and froze. The ceiling vent above the stove had shifted slightly. Not open, not broken, just off-center. Like it had been touched. He pulled a chair over and reached up. The screws were loose. One hung half out. He didn't remember it being that way. The next day, he bought a screwdriver, removed the vent cover, and peered inside with his phone flashlight. Nothing but darkness and thick dust. But carved into the inside edge of the vent's metal frame, barely visible in the grime, was something that made his breath catch. A name. His name. Scratched in jagged lines as if with a nail. 5 letters. First name only. It hadn't always been there, he was sure of it. He would have noticed. He dropped the cover and backed away. The metal clanged as it hit the tile. He didn't sleep that night. The crying started again, louder, more desperate. It came from everywhere now, above, behind the walls, even from inside the vents. Like it was traveling through the very bones of the building, looking for a way out. Or in. He thought about calling the police. But what could he say? That someone might be living in a sealed unit above him? That a dead woman was crying through his walls? That his name was scratched into a vent? He already knew how that would sound. By the end of that week, he was drinking more. Anything to slow the thoughts, numb the questions. But alcohol did little to silence the noises. If anything, it made them clearer. And one night, as he drifted in and out on the couch, he heard something new. Not footsteps. Not crying. A voice. Male. Deep, calm. Talking in a low murmur through the floor above, as if recording a message. He couldn't make out the words, only the tone. But one sentence pierced through clearly, like it was meant for him alone. I know you're listening. The voice didn't continue. Just silence. A crushing, total silence that rang in his ears. He stood, heart pounding, staring up at the ceiling. He waited. But nothing came. The next morning, he tore up the vent in his bedroom. Dug at the edges of the closet wall. He needed to see inside. Needed proof. That's when he found the first cassette tape. Hidden in the floor beneath the vent shaft. Old, covered in dust, labeled in shaky handwriting. Number 13, 2:17 a.m. There were others beneath it. Stacked neatly. All numbered. All stamped with dates from more than a decade ago. Except the last one. The one on top. It had tomorrow's date. And it had his name written across it. He stared at the tape for what felt like hours. The handwriting was unmistakably human, jagged but deliberate. And yet, the date scrawled across it was not just recent. It hadn't even happened yet. How could someone have known he would find it? How could something be labeled with a day that hadn't come? He didn't own a cassette player. The tapes were useless to him in their current state, silent threats sealed in plastic. He stuffed them into a shoebox and shoved it under his bed, unsure whether to treat them like evidence or cursed objects. But every creak of the apartment, every groan of old pipes, now felt like confirmation. Someone knew he had them. And maybe, someone was waiting for him to listen. The next morning, he scoured secondhand stores until he found an old Sony tape recorder with a dusty plastic case and worn play buttons. The kind of device someone would have used in the early 2000s to record a confession, or a diary, or a warning. When he got home, he locked the door, drew the blinds, and sat with the first tape. The one labeled #13-217 AM. He hesitated before pressing play. His hand shook as the tape whirred to life, the magnetic ribbon stretching between spools like an old artery pumping something too old to be alive. The recording began with static. Then a woman's voice. Soft. Breathy. Tired. If you're hearing this, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you believe any of it. I barely believe it myself. But I have to say it out loud. I have to make a record in case. The rest was drowned by distortion, then a loud bang, like something being dropped or thrown. I think he's watching again, she continued. I think he's in the walls tonight. I saw the mirror fog up even though I didn't shower. The window was open and I could see his reflection, but not mine. Please, if you find this, don't ignore it. Don't let him know you're listening. She was crying now. Not sobbing, quiet, resigned weeping. Like someone who had cried every night for years and had no tears left. Then the tape ended. No scream. No climax. Just the soft click of the recorder stopping. He sat frozen. His apartment, once silent, now felt like it was holding its breath. Like the walls were listening to him the way he had just listened to her. He played another. This one was dated 2 nights later. Her voice was shakier now. I thought I was safe after I sealed the vents. But last night I woke up with the tape recorder playing by itself. A tape I didn't insert. It said my name. It said I'd forgotten something. But I didn't forget. I remember every word he ever whispered through these walls. Her tone cracked mid-sentence. Not from emotion, from fear. Not the fear of being attacked, but the deeper kind. The fear of being known by something that shouldn't be able to know you. There's a pattern, she whispered. It's not just me. It's everyone who lives here. Same noises. Same paranoia. Same silence from management. Same dreams. It's like we're being recycled. Like someone's running the same program over and over, seeing how far we'll go before we break. He never leaves. He never stops. That phrase struck him. Recycled. It made him think of all the times he'd passed another tenant in the hallway but couldn't remember their face. The way some neighbors never seemed to carry groceries or get packages. The strange stillness of the building at night, even in a city that never slept. He checked his lease. The name of the previous tenant wasn't listed. Just a blank space under previous occupancy. When he asked the landlord again, the man only grunted. Said records had been lost. Said it wasn't important. But he was starting to think that it was very important. Maybe the most important part. That night, he dreamt of footsteps pacing above his head. But in the dream, he wasn't lying in bed, he was on the ceiling, looking down at himself. Watching his own body breathe. Listening to his own thoughts echo back at him with unfamiliar words. When he woke, he felt hungover though he hadn't drunk. Something had changed. The atmosphere of the apartment had shifted, like gravity pulled in a new direction. He found another tape on the floor of the hallway. Not in a shoebox. Not hidden. Just lying there. Waiting. It had his name again. No number. No date. Only the word, again. And then, for the first time, he heard a knock from the ceiling above. 3 knocks. Slow. Rhythmic. Measured. Someone was up there. Someone knew he was listening. And someone wanted him to continue. He didn't sleep after the knocks. He didn't even move. For the first time in his life, silence felt like a living thing, like it wrapped around him with a weight, pressing on his chest, whispering ideas he didn't want to think. Every creak of the ceiling now carried intent. Every sound held the suggestion of a presence that was no longer hiding. It was watching. Waiting. Listening just as much as he was. The new tape sat on his desk for 2 full days. He avoided it like a loaded gun, fully aware that playing it would only deepen whatever hole he had already begun falling into. The label was hauntingly sparse, just his name and the word again. There was no date, no message, just a knowing. As though it wasn't even meant to be found but placed for him deliberately. Not an accident. A ritual. He finally played it after waking up to find the tape recorder turned on by itself. The play button was pressed, but no tape was inside. His hands shook as he loaded the cassette, half expecting the tape to jam or snap. But it didn't. It played perfectly. There was no voice at first. Just the hum of room tone, faint static, the low buzz of electricity, the occasional creak of floorboards. Then, breathing. Not gasping. Calm, controlled, and close. As if someone were standing directly in front of the microphone, watching him. And then, his own voice. Not a recording of something he remembered saying. Something else. Something he never said. "They never believed me either," the voice said, calmly, like a reflection. "I used to think I was just paranoid. That maybe the sounds were just the building settling, or old pipes, or my mind unraveling. But then I found the recordings. And I listened. And I understood." A pause. Then the sound of something being dragged across the floor, faint but deliberate. "You're following the pattern, aren't you? You're not the first. You won't be the last." He slammed stop on the recorder and ripped the tape out, nearly snapping it. But the damage was already done. His voice, whatever it was, had spoken. And the worst part was that some deep part of him recognized the tone. It wasn't like hearing an echo. It was like hearing the thoughts he'd had, but never dared say out loud. As if the apartment itself had read his mind and spoken it back. He began obsessing over the floor plan of the building. Something about the layout bothered him. There were too many discrepancies, units that should have had windows but didn't, doors that faced brick walls, vents that didn't connect to anything. He asked a neighbor about the unit above his. "Been empty for years," they said. "No one wants to touch it. Some kind of death up there. They say the woman locked herself in and starved. Or maybe someone did it to her. Nobody knows." But the building records were missing. Property management offered no answers. In fact, the more he asked, the more people seemed to forget he had asked at all. Conversations he clearly remembered left no trace. No callbacks. No follow-ups. It was like he was speaking into a void. Or being erased in real time. He started marking the walls, small pencil notches in the corners, just enough to tell if anything moved. The next morning, 3 of the marks were gone. Not rubbed away. The drywall itself was replaced. New texture. Fresh paint. He pulled at the tape on a vent cover in his living room. Behind it was darkness. Not ductwork, just empty space. It stretched deeper than the wall should allow. He dropped a marble into it, counting seconds until it hit something. He never heard it land. That same day, his reflection in the bathroom mirror lingered for a second longer than he did. Not an illusion. Not a trick of light. He turned his head, and the reflection paused, watching him go. Then it followed. That night, the crying returned. Softer now. Closer. No longer muffled by distance or architecture. It came from within the room itself, not above. And when he looked up at the ceiling, he saw faint indentations, like footprints, pressing outward from the plaster. He began speaking aloud to himself, just to hear his own voice. Just to drown out the silence. But each time he stopped talking, he thought he could hear someone else continue the sentence. He played the final tape. The one he'd hidden deep in the drawer. It had no label at all. Just a piece of black tape across the center. It was only 5 seconds long. And it said, "You're next." No voice. Just the sound of someone whispering directly into the microphone, and the sudden, unmistakable sound of footsteps running away, down, not up. And now, every time he tries to sleep, he feels it, something pacing below the floorboards, as if the building has turned upside down, and he's the one living above something else. Or someone. The patterns were no longer random. They were structured, deliberate, and intelligent. Every sound followed a schedule, every movement seemed reactive. Whenever a question formed in his mind, the apartment responded, not with words, but with subtle shifts, creaks in the floorboards, or the hum of unseen activity behind the walls. The air itself felt thicker, like it was holding secrets just out of reach. He began to suspect he was being taught something, as if whatever resided above, or within, was leading him down a path mapped out long before he arrived. On the 7th day, he discovered another tape, this time tucked inside a hollow section of the baseboard near his bed. It was wrapped in brittle paper that crumbled in his hands, revealing a handwritten date from 12 years ago, the same year the woman was found dead upstairs. But beneath the date was his own name, again, followed by a word that made his stomach drop, retake. The implication was disturbing. As if he had already lived this once. As if the events were recurring, looping through time like a record playing endlessly until the right outcome emerged. He played the tape in silence, bracing for answers. What he heard was not a voice, but the rhythmic sound of breathing, interrupted by irregular clicking noises, like fingernails tapping wood. Then a whisper barely audible through the static, "Stop looking." It repeated once, then silence. But when he rewound it and played it again, the message changed. Same breath, same tapping, but this time, keep going. He repeated the process a third time, and the whisper offered something new: we are watching. The tape didn't just contain a message. It responded. Like it was listening to him listening to it. Paranoia bloomed into obsession. He stopped sleeping. He mapped out the entire apartment, marking every sound, every cold spot, every part of the floor that didn't creak like it should. When he touched one of the warmer panels in the hallway, it pulsed beneath his fingers. Not like machinery, like a heartbeat. The walls weren't just hiding something, they were alive. Pulsing. Aware. There was something behind them, and it wasn't staying still anymore. The history of the building provided no comfort. Records had gaps, renovations that were never completed, tenants that moved in and vanished without forwarding addresses. The death upstairs, previously ruled an accident, now seemed like a cover story. Her name, Amelia Rook, had shown up in a scattered number of files: hospital admissions for anxiety, police reports for harassment, and a final 911 call that lasted only 28 seconds before cutting off. That call had never been released publicly. But now, after a night of inexplicable static coming through his wall-mounted intercom, he found that same 28-second clip recorded onto another unmarked tape placed near his kitchen sink. The voice on the call wasn't panicked. It was hollow. "Come. He's inside," she said. "But I'm not scared anymore. I understand now. It's not about him. It's about the room. The room watches. The room remembers." That word, remembers, clung to his thoughts like fog. Rooms didn't remember. Buildings didn't think. But this one did. He felt it in the way his thoughts sometimes weren't his. He'd reach for objects he didn't remember owning. He'd wake up with dirt under his fingernails and no memory of leaving the bed. He found a note in his own handwriting that read, "Don't go up there yet. It isn't time." But he had no memory of writing it. The pen was still on the table, uncapped. The ink was fresh. And then the layout of the apartment changed. Not dramatically, just enough to unsettle. A door that used to open inward now swung outward. The coat closet had one more hook than he remembered. The crack in the hallway tile disappeared completely. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But then the bathroom mirror changed shape, slightly narrower, and his reflection appeared subtly delayed when he moved. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't his mind playing games. The apartment was rearranging itself. He tried to leave. Once. He packed a small bag and stepped out into the hallway, but the elevator was gone. Not broken, gone. Just an empty shaft behind sealed metal doors. The stairwell that should have led to the lobby only went upward. No matter how many flights he descended, he returned to the same landing. Apartment 6B. His door. Always waiting for him. Always unlocked. And then he saw it. A handprint on the inside of the hallway window. Small. Childlike. Pressed from the other side. But there were no children in the building. None that lived here. None that ever did. The apartment above was no longer just a mystery. It was an infection. A memory looping through time, reshaping the present, turning the living into echoes of those who came before. And now it was his turn to be rewritten. The sense of self began to fray. Time no longer moved in a straight line. Thoughts came in echoes, like fragments left by someone else, looping through his mind with uncanny familiarity. He would start a sentence and realize he had already finished it minutes earlier. Entire days evaporated into thin air. Sometimes, he would awaken on the floor with his hands bruised and dirt beneath his fingernails again, even though the windows remained locked and the door never opened. Something was unraveling, not just in the apartment, but within him. The deeper he went, the more the building seemed to seep into him, folding his memories, stitching its own into the gaps. The mirror in the bathroom no longer reflected what he expected. The man staring back looked older some days, unfamiliar, his face more tired than he felt, his eyes flickering like static in a weak signal. Sometimes his reflection moved just a second too late. Other times, it didn't move at all. There was a moment, brief but chilling, when the man in the mirror blinked before he did. That night, he covered it with a towel and refused to look again. Every corner of the apartment began to feel like a replica of itself, duplicated just slightly wrong, like copies made from copies, details smudged, proportions off. The hallway was a little too long. The floorboards creaked in patterns that resembled breathing. A door would close, and a second later, he'd hear it opening again, from the inside. He would leave the bedroom and find the living room arranged differently, as if someone had been sitting there, waiting. Nothing stayed where he left it. And the light bulbs began to dim without dying, casting the walls in an amber hue that felt old and sick. Another tape appeared in the mailbox, though he hadn't left the apartment. It had no label, just a single scratch along the edge of the cassette. When he played it, the voice was different this time. It was his own. Not recorded in the past, but speaking in the present, describing things he hadn't said yet. It whispered details about things he would think. Then it described the room he was standing in with uncanny precision, including the way he clutched his arm out of habit when nervous. The recording ended with a line that silenced everything in his mind: "Don't check the wall behind the bookshelf." Not yet. The next morning, the bookshelf had shifted 6 inches to the left. He tried to force himself back to rationality. He read articles on sleep deprivation, on paranoia, on building acoustics. None of them explained why the scratches on the floor spelled out his name. None of them explained why the pigeons on the windowsill all turned their heads in unison, staring inward. None explained the tiny holes he found drilled into the ceiling, aligned perfectly with where his bed, his couch, and his shower were located. Like viewing points. Like something, or someone, had been watching. His phone no longer received calls from numbers he recognized. Every missed call came from unknown. And when he answered once, holding his breath, the voice was a broken whisper layered over 100 others, all overlapping like a choir made of ghosts. They didn't speak words. They wept. And underneath it all, one voice repeated, "He's watching from underneath." That night, he moved his bed and found a panel in the floor that had not been sealed. Underneath it was a recess containing 5 more tapes. Each one had his name written in different handwriting. On one of them, his last name was misspelled, exactly how he used to write it as a child. The implication was immediate and devastating. These tapes weren't just addressed to him. They were from versions of him. Versions who had lived in this space before. Versions who had failed to escape. He listened to one. The voice on it broke down midway through the recording, sobbing uncontrollably, whispering, "It learns from us. Every time we try something new, it adapts. You can't outsmart it." Another tape ended with a single phrase, whispered over and over again, growing more urgent with each repetition: "You let him in. You let him in. You let him in." The last tape didn't contain a voice, only the sound of a heartbeat. Slow. Deliberate. Measured. And then it stopped. The apartment wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It didn't just hold on to energy or echo the past. It consumed identity. It recycled reality. It learned from its tenants, studied them, copied them, and fed on their confusion. The same way it had watched Amelia, it now watched him, molding his existence into a script written long ago but still being revised. He wasn't solving a mystery. He was becoming part of it. Everything started to repeat. Not in exact copies, but in strange approximations, days that felt eerily similar, events that mirrored previous ones but with slight differences. A knock at the door came at the same time each evening, but the sound changed. One night it was soft, timid. The next, loud and urgent. Sometimes it was a pattern, like Morse code. He never opened the door. He didn't need to. Because after the knock faded, something always moved inside the apartment anyway. Behind him. In the walls. Inside the vents. Like it had always been here, waiting for him to notice. Familiar objects started to disappear. Not stolen, not misplaced, just erased. The coffee mug he used every morning no longer existed, not even as a memory in the kitchen cabinet. His favorite hoodie was gone, and in its place was a similar one, subtly wrong in color and fit. A picture frame that once held a photo of his parents was now empty, and he couldn't remember their faces clearly anymore. Something was rewriting his life, slowly replacing pieces of it with hollow replicas. At first he thought it was his mind deteriorating under stress, but then he found the notebook he never remembered buying, filled with entries he didn't write. They were in his handwriting, dated over months he hadn't lived there yet. One entry read, "If you find this before the 23rd, leave through the fire escape. If you wait, it won't let you." He circled the 23rd on the calendar. But every morning, it remained the 18th. He began to test his own perception. Left objects in specific places, took pictures, marked the walls in pencil. Some days, everything matched. Other days, the marks vanished. He would wake up with new bruises, cuts on his hands, even mud on his socks, though the floor was spotless and the windows never opened. His body was doing things without him. Or maybe someone, or something, was puppeteering through him, using his form like a suit. He remembered blinking and seeing another version of himself in the hallway mirror, just for a second, before it vanished. That image haunted him more than anything else. The neighbors had stopped speaking to him. The friendly nods in the hallway turned into blank stares, as if they didn't recognize him anymore. A woman on the 3rd floor backed away when he entered the elevator, mumbling something under her breath in a language he didn't know. Another tenant, a boy no older than 12, once whispered as he passed, "It doesn't like when you dig." He hadn't spoken about digging. He hadn't even told anyone about the panel under his bed. Yet somehow, the building knew. He tried to leave. Packed a bag, wrote a note to himself, and walked out. made it to the sidewalk, felt the cold bite of wind on his face, started toward the subway, and then woke up back in his bed. Fully dressed. Bag gone. Note gone. He checked the hallway security footage online, but there was nothing after 11:03 p.m., the moment he left. The footage resumed at 2:16 a.m., showing only static. He wasn't in it. Another tape arrived, this one left in the fridge. Cold. Titled Entry 1. It was his voice again, calm and detached, explaining how the building worked, as if giving a tutorial. You're not trapped physically. It holds your choices hostage. You can walk out anytime you want, but everything you leave behind becomes bait to bring you back. If you stay too long, it makes copies of you. The copies begin to replace your memories, then your behavior. Eventually, even your thoughts belong to it. He threw the tape against the wall. It cracked but didn't break. When he went to pick it up, he found a different tape beneath it, one labeled Last Exit. That tape was blank. Completely silent for 60 minutes. Then, at the end, one breath. One single inhale. His own. The floors creaked differently after that. More deliberate. Like footsteps made of wood and intention. The apartment began to feel smaller, tighter, even though the measurements hadn't changed. The door seemed farther away than it used to be. The ceiling seemed lower. Every time he blinked, it felt like something shifted in the corners of his vision, edges becoming fluid, straight lines curving. The geometry of the place was becoming unstable, as if the walls were bending inward, preparing to close. He started to write everything down. Not because he thought it would help him escape, but because he needed to remember what was real. Each sentence felt like anchoring a piece of his identity. But even the notebook began to betray him. Sentences he hadn't written appeared between the lines. He is almost ready. We are so proud of you. It will be easier if you stop resisting. He tore those pages out. Burned them. The next morning, they were back, untouched, perfectly slotted in place. He no longer trusted time. No longer trusted reflection. No longer trusted his voice or his thoughts. But he hadn't given up. Because something inside him whispered that the only way out was to finish what had been started 12 years ago. Amelia's story hadn't ended. It had been paused. And now it was playing again, through him. The tape recorder was the key. He understood that now. Not just a device, but a door. A vessel carrying the fragments of a past that refused to die. The tapes were more than confessions or recordings, they were breadcrumbs, a map left behind by Amelia, by whoever she had been before the silence swallowed her whole. Each reel, each hiss and crackle, spoke in a language of fear and desperation, but also of clues hidden beneath layers of paranoia. His fingers trembled as he rewound the tape with his own name on it, the one he'd found beneath the floorboards. The voice that emerged was hesitant, wavering, as if the speaker fought to hold on to sanity while reliving something horrific. She spoke of shadows lurking just outside the window, voices in the night, and the feeling of being watched without ever seeing the watcher. Then a pause, a breath drawn sharply, and a whispered warning, "He is closer than you think." Closer. The word echoed inside him, growing louder every time he heard it. Who was he? The stalker Amelia had recorded? Or was it something else? Something that never left, never faded. The pattern began to reveal itself, not just in the tapes, but in the apartment itself. The cold spots that shifted with no logical explanation. The faint scratches in the wood that appeared overnight, shaping letters that didn't make sense. The ceiling cracks that resembled a web, expanding each day. He found himself walking the edges of the apartment, trailing his fingertips along the walls as if they might whisper secrets. There was a rhythm to it all, a pulse beneath the surface, that felt alive. Something breathing in the dark. The apartment was not just a place, it was a presence. And it was growing stronger. He tried to explain what was happening to anyone who would listen, but his words sounded hollow, even to himself. How could he describe the apartment folding in on him, his reflection betraying him, the tapes that spoke in his voice but said things he'd never thought? His friends stopped calling. Texts went unanswered. It was like he was disappearing from their world as surely as the apartment erased pieces of his own. In the few lucid moments, he scoured online archives, news articles, and forums. Amelia's name surfaced in police reports from years ago. The woman had been found dead inside the apartment, locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry. The official cause was listed as suicide, but whispers and rumors suggested something darker. She had been terrified, recording voices, capturing confessions that never reached the police. Someone had wanted to silence her, and the silence had persisted for 12 years. But why was he being drawn into the same nightmare? Was it coincidence, or had the apartment chosen him? He remembered the note on one tape, "You let him in." Had he unknowingly invited the same horror into his life? The idea chilled him more than the cold drafts that swept through the rooms. Then came the dreams. At first, they were just fragments, faint cries, shadows darting in corners of vision. But they grew vivid and unrelenting. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unable to tell where the nightmare ended and reality began. In the dreams, he was Amelia, trapped, desperate, whispering warnings to someone who never listened. The stalker's face was never clear, but the feeling of eyes boring into his soul was unmistakable. The boundary between his own memories and hers blurred. Moments from his past mixed with her recordings, creating a tapestry of confusion. He questioned his own sanity. Was he breaking or merging with something else? The apartment didn't just steal time and objects, it invaded identity. One evening, the power flickered and died. In the darkness, the silence was suffocating. But then he heard it, soft footsteps, hesitant but unmistakable, pacing the floor above. The crying returned, low and raw, ripping through the silence like a wound. His heart thundered, but he didn't run. He couldn't. He realized the stalker was never caught because he never left. He was the apartment's ghost, a parasite feeding on fear and isolation, twisting reality until its prey became a puppet. And now, the cycle had begun again, with him as the new Amelia, destined to vanish into the silent apartment above. The realization was terrifying but also oddly freeing. If he could understand the pattern, maybe he could break it. Maybe the tapes weren't just relics of a past tragedy but tools to unravel the nightmare. The apartment thrived on silence, on secrets buried beneath the floorboards and walls. But sound, confession, exposure, could weaken it. He began to speak aloud what the tapes revealed, repeating warnings, naming the stalker, describing the terror. The apartment seemed to resist, doors slammed, lights flickered, but he persisted. Every confession was a crack in the facade, every word a strike against the invisible force holding him captive. And then, beneath the floor where the tapes were found, he discovered another hidden panel. Inside was a journal, Amelia's. Her handwriting was frantic, filled with codes, names, dates, and most hauntingly, pleas for help. The last entry was a scrawl of desperation: "If you're reading this, you're next. Beware the man who watches without eyes." The stalker had been more than just a man. He was a shadow without form, a presence that transcended time and space within the apartment's walls. And now, the stalking wasn't just physical but psychological, a hunt for the soul. He wasn't alone. Amelia was still here, her voice echoing through the tapes and journal, guiding him. The silent apartment above wasn't just a place of death, it was a trap designed to feed and recreate itself endlessly. But with Amelia's clues, there was a chance to break free. The question remained: would he escape the cycle, or would he become another voice recorded in the dark, another name etched into the scratches beneath the floor? The journal had become his lifeline. Each page a thread to hold onto, a guide through the maze of terror that threatened to consume him. Amelia's words were raw, fragmented, but there was purpose in the chaos, a roadmap coded in desperation and fear. He traced her handwriting over and over, memorizing names, dates, warnings that flickered like distant beacons in the darkness. He learned that Amelia had tried to expose the stalker by recording his confessions in secret, hoping the evidence would bring him to justice. But the tapes were never enough. The stalker was elusive, always slipping through the cracks, invisible in plain sight. The police had dismissed her claims as paranoia, blaming her death on mental illness rather than acknowledging the threat that stalked her final days. The silence after her death wasn't peace, it was surrender. The apartment itself was a prison. Every detail mattered: the locked doors, the thin walls that seemed to absorb sound, the floorboards that hid secrets beneath their creaking surface. He realized the place was alive in a way, feeding off isolation, paranoia, and fear. It twisted time, warped memory, and blurred the line between hunter and prey. The apartment's silence wasn't empty, it was full of things left unsaid, things buried and forgotten, waiting for the right moment to surface. His nights grew restless. The crying from above shifted, sometimes to moans, other times to desperate whispers. At times it was Amelia's voice, other times something deeper, more menacing. He wasn't sure if he was hearing the past or the present, or if the two had merged into something unrecognizable. The tapes told a story, but the apartment rewrote it constantly. His own footsteps echoed like someone else's, and sometimes he caught himself speaking aloud things he didn't remember deciding to say. Sleep became a battleground. He dreamed of locked doors opening into endless hallways, shadows that stretched and multiplied, voices that called his name from empty rooms. Waking moments blurred into dreams, and the dreamscape began to feel more real than the daylight world. The apartment's hold tightened with every cycle of night and day, pulling him deeper into its silent web. Then, one evening, a knock came, not from the apartment above, but from his own door. It was slow, deliberate, insistent. His breath caught, heart pounding as the knocking continued. He hesitated, every instinct screaming to ignore it. But something compelled him to look through the peephole. No one was there. Yet, the knocking persisted, softer now, coming from inside the apartment. Behind the walls. Beneath the floor. Somewhere unseen, but unmistakably present. It wasn't a visitor, it was a message. The apartment was speaking in its own language, a rhythm of fear and control. He listened closely, mapping the knocks to a pattern. It wasn't random, it was a code. Letters forming words. The knock spelled out a phrase he recognized instantly, "Help me." The chilling realization hit him, Amelia's voice was trapped in the apartment, reaching out from beyond her death. The stalker hadn't just taken her life, he had imprisoned her spirit in the silence above. The apartment wasn't just haunted by memories, it was a tomb for her soul. He knew he had to respond. Using the old tape recorder, he tapped back, mirroring the knocks, sending messages into the void. The apartment answered, knocks shifting into new sequences, revealing fragments of a story, a warning about the stalker's identity, hints of his methods, secrets about how he manipulated and controlled not just Amelia but others before her. The stalker was not just a man, he was a presence, a force embedded in the fabric of the building itself. The deeper he delved, the more the apartment resisted. Lights flickered violently. Doors slammed shut without warning. The crying grew into a wail, raw and desperate. It was as if the building fought to keep its secrets buried, to maintain the silence that fed it. But the taps persisted, a fragile lifeline connecting two trapped souls. Amelia's story was incomplete. Pieces were missing, names left out, dates altered, events erased. The stalker's identity remained a shadow, a ghost with no face. But the tapes and knocks offered clues, a neighbor who never appeared in records, a man who visited occasionally, a voice recorded on the tapes that didn't match Amelia's. The stalker was closer than he'd ever imagined, perhaps even watching him now. Fear was no longer an abstract threat, it was a presence in every corner, lurking just beyond vision. He felt eyes on him constantly, unseen watchers lurking behind mirrors, in reflections that didn't match his movements. The apartment was watching back, learning, adapting. His reality fractured under the weight of suspicion and dread. He questioned his own sanity. Was he becoming the stalker's next victim, or worse, the stalker himself? The tapes hinted at a cyclical horror, a pattern where the prey became the hunter, trapped forever in a loop of fear and violence. The more he uncovered, the more he felt himself slipping into that role, the boundaries between victim and perpetrator dissolving. The apartment's silence was deafening now, a pressure that squeezed his mind, distorting memories until nothing was certain. He clung to Amelia's journal, the only tangible proof that he wasn't alone. But even the journal was incomplete, its pages torn and stained. The final entry was missing, as if someone, or something, had erased it. He understood then that to break the cycle, he needed to finish Amelia's story. To expose the stalker, to reveal the truth hidden in the silence. But the apartment would not let him do so easily. Every step toward the truth was met with resistance, every discovery shadowed by danger. The question remained, how do you fight an enemy that exists in the silence? How do you confront a presence that lives in shadows, feeds on fear, and controls reality itself? There was only one way to find out. The apartment's atmosphere thickened, as if it were a living entity growing aware of his determination. Every sound, every breath, seemed amplified, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind slipping through cracked windows, the faint tapping beneath the walls that mimicked a heartbeat. He understood that the apartment wasn't just a setting, it was a predator, patient and calculated, watching him unravel its dark secrets. With Amelia's fragmented journal and the cryptic knocks decoded, he began piecing together a timeline, one that blurred the lines between reality and madness. Amelia's paranoia wasn't unfounded, it was a survival instinct sharpened by relentless stalking. The stalker wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone who had lived within the building's walls, an invisible tenant whose presence seeped into the fabric of the place like poison. The stalker's pattern was insidious. He was never physically seen by others but always there, heard but never caught. His tactics were psychological torture, whispered threats, anonymous gifts, twisted notes slipped under doors. Amelia's recordings revealed a man obsessed, patient beyond reason, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The silence was his weapon, isolating his victims and suffocating their hope of rescue. As he listened to the tapes again, one recording caught his attention, a distorted voice, layered beneath Amelia's confession, almost like a distorted echo. It was chilling in its emptiness, a sound that was both a presence and an absence, like static on a radio that was tuned to a frequency no one else could hear. That voice seemed to ripple through the apartment, touching every surface and sinking into every corner. It was the stalker's signature, a reminder that he was always near, even if unseen. He started leaving his own messages, speaking into the recorder during quiet moments, hoping to provoke a response. The apartment answered with sudden cold drafts, flickering lights, and sometimes, the faintest echoes of footsteps pacing above. His voice trembled as he confronted the silence directly, calling out names from the journal, asking questions that only the stalker could answer. Night after night, the cycle repeated. The apartment grew more hostile, the atmosphere more suffocating. He wasn't just listening to the stalker's confession, he was becoming part of it. The boundaries blurred, memories from Amelia's recordings bleeding into his own waking hours. He caught himself repeating phrases from the tapes, whispering warnings he hadn't yet fully understood, feeling a growing paranoia that mirrored Amelia's last days. Sleep became a battlefield. Nightmares invaded his rest with vivid scenes of locked doors and shattered windows, of frantic running and shadowy figures closing in. Sometimes, he awoke to the sound of crying that wasn't his own, tears streaming down his face though he didn't understand why. The apartment was invading his mind, breaking down his sense of self. A creeping suspicion took hold. Was he merely a victim, or had the stalker already infected his mind? The tape suggested a cycle where the hunted slowly turned into the hunter, trapped in a pattern that repeated itself endlessly. It was as if the stalker's power was not just physical but psychic, a parasitic force that consumed one identity and imposed another. He scrutinized the apartment's layout, mapping the creaks, drafts, and noises to invisible movements. Certain spots felt charged, almost magnetic. Beneath a loose floorboard, he found a small cache of old objects, a cracked photograph of a woman with haunted eyes, a torn newspaper clipping about a missing tenant, and a rusty key with no obvious lock. Each item whispered fragments of stories long buried, adding pieces to the puzzle but deepening the mystery. The photograph felt especially important. The woman's eyes seemed to follow him, filled with silent pleas. He recognized her from one of Amelia's taped confessions, a neighbor who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, never mentioned in official records. The stalker's trail was littered with ghosts, each vanished victim swallowed by the apartment's silence. Compelled to dig deeper, he ventured into the building's public archives. Old rental records, police reports, and faded newspaper articles painted a grim history. The apartment had been the epicenter of disappearances and unsolved mysteries spanning decades. Names vanished without a trace. Tenants moved out abruptly, driven away by fear or madness. And through it all, one constant remained, the locked apartment above, untouched, a silent sentinel to the horrors it concealed. The authorities had declared Amelia's death a suicide, closing the case with clinical detachment. But the whispers told a different story, one of stalking, of psychological torment, and of a killer who knew how to manipulate fear to deadly effect. The locked door was not a barrier from the outside world, it was a prison trap, designed to keep the stalker's victim isolated until the final act. Returning home, the weight of this knowledge pressed down on him. The apartment had ensnared him not by chance, but by design. It was no coincidence that his name appeared on the tapes. He was part of the story, whether by fate or by the stalker's plan. The realization was chilling, the cycle was not broken, it was beginning anew, with him as the new Amelia. His only hope was to expose the truth, to break the silence that had fed the stalker for years. But doing so meant facing the unseen force lurking above, confronting a presence that defied logic and evaded capture. The apartment was a trap, a labyrinth of fear and manipulation that fed on the weak and invisible. And now, he was the prey. The tapes became an obsession. Each one was a puzzle piece revealing new layers of Amelia's torment, but also hinting at something darker, something that twisted beyond a single stalker's obsession. The voice on the tapes, distorted and fragmented, wasn't just one man's whisper, it was a collage of voices, overlapping threats, and cruel mockery that seemed to echo through the walls of the apartment itself. It was as if the building had absorbed every scream, every confession, and was now replaying them in an endless loop. He began to notice patterns in the sounds, rhythms and repetitions that weren't random but deliberate. The stalker's voice would sometimes pause, as if waiting for a response, and the silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with menace. The apartment wasn't just a physical space, it was a trap designed to manipulate perception, bending time and memory until reality itself became unreliable. His own footsteps echoed strangely now, sometimes delayed, as if the apartment was mocking him, repeating his movements with a slight, unsettling lag. The crying from above grew more frequent, shifting from despair to anger to something almost triumphant, as if the trapped spirit was struggling against the stalker's grip, fighting to be heard. Despite the terror, he pressed on, driven by a growing conviction that the stalker's identity lay buried somewhere in the apartment's history. Records were incomplete, official files sanitized or destroyed. But underground forums, old blogs, and obscure message boards whispered about a man who had once lived in the building, a tenant who had vanished without a trace shortly before Amelia's death. Rumors spoke of his obsession with Amelia, his reputation for intimidation, and a chilling history of others who had disappeared mysteriously. His research revealed a name, Leonard Graves. A man with a criminal past, charges dropped or quietly settled, never fully prosecuted. Graves was a ghost in the system, someone who knew how to vanish in plain sight and exert control from the shadows. The story suggested he was a master of psychological terror, using silence and fear to dominate his victims. Armed with this knowledge, he felt both relief and dread. The stalker wasn't an amorphous force, he was real, a man who had left a trail of broken lives and vanished souls. But if Graves was still around, lurking somewhere in the building or its vicinity, then the danger was immediate and personal. That night, the apartment seemed to shift. The walls pulsed with a faint vibration, the temperature dropping suddenly as the crying morphed into whispers that circled his ears like vultures. The tapes flickered with static, and through the haze, a voice emerged, not Amelia's, not the stalker's, but his own. The voice was faint, distorted, repeating phrases he didn't remember speaking. "I am here. You cannot escape. The silence binds us." He staggered back, heart racing, the line between his thoughts and the apartment's echo blurring dangerously. Was he losing his mind, or was the stalker reaching deeper, invading his psyche? He forced himself to focus. The stalker's power wasn't supernatural, it was psychological warfare, exploiting isolation, paranoia, and trauma to trap victims in a self-perpetuating nightmare. But even so, the apartment was more than just a battleground, it was a weapon shaped by years of violence and silence. Determined to fight back, he devised a plan. He would confront the locked apartment above, not by breaking down the door or storming in blindly, but by using the stalker's own methods against him. If the stalker communicated through silence, through sound, then he would turn silence into a weapon of exposure. He set up speakers throughout his apartment, hooked to the old tape player. Through them, he would broadcast Amelia's confessions, the stalker's threats, the voices from the past, filling every corner with sound until there was no room left for silence to hide. As the recordings played, the apartment reacted violently. Lights flickered, shadows stretched unnaturally, and the temperature swung erratically. But beneath the chaos, the crying turned into screams, and then, gradually, silence. For the first time, the oppressive stillness was broken. The next morning, the locked door above was different. It no longer seemed like a barrier but a challenge. Behind it lay the final truth, the identity of the stalker, the fate of Amelia, and the key to breaking the cycle. But unlocking that door meant facing the darkness head-on. He wasn't sure if he was ready, or if the stalker would allow him to escape once he crossed the threshold. The apartment's silence had always been a cage. Now, it was a doorway. The locked apartment above was more than just a physical space, it was a tomb preserving the echoes of past horrors. He felt the weight of countless secrets pressed behind that door, and the knowledge that once opened, nothing would be the same. The sense of inevitability settled on him like a shroud, the moment of confrontation was drawing near, and with it, the possibility of discovering truths that might shatter his grip on reality. Every night, the sounds from above shifted, footsteps pacing in patterns too precise to be random, soft murmurs that slipped through the cracks, and the unmistakable sound of sobbing. These sounds were no longer background noise, they had become a language he was forced to learn, a coded message left by the woman who died inside. Her voice, broken and desperate, seemed to reach out, pulling him toward a truth that had long been buried. His investigation now felt like a race against time. The tapes revealed that Amelia had been documenting more than just her stalker's identity, she had uncovered a network of manipulation and fear, a twisted game that extended far beyond the walls of the building. The stalker's reach was not confined to one apartment or one victim, it was a shadow cast over many lives, and the apartment itself was the heart of that darkness. A chilling realization began to take hold, the stalker was still active, still watching, still waiting. The knowledge that he had been marked by the same unseen force brought with it a paralyzing fear. The stalker's obsession wasn't with Amelia alone, it was with the pattern, the repetition, the cycle of control that fed on silence and secrecy. He was trapped in a mirror of Amelia's fate, caught in the same web of fear and helplessness. Attempts to contact the outside world became fraught with paranoia. Phone calls dropped mysteriously, messages went unanswered. Even trusted friends seemed distant, their voices hollow or distracted. It was as if the stalker's influence extended beyond the apartment's walls, severing connections and isolating him further. The silence wasn't just physical, it was social, a deliberate severing of ties to the outside world. He began to question his own memories. Were the voices on the tapes reflections of his mind, or were they recordings of a reality he was blind to? The line between past and present blurred, his identity fractured by the echoes of a woman's desperate recordings and a stalker's cruel whispers. Each night, the crying grew louder, more insistent, dragging him deeper into a spiral of fear and uncertainty. In his darkest moments, he wondered if the stalker was no longer a person but a manifestation of the apartment's malevolence, a spirit of vengeance born from years of pain and neglect. The building itself seemed alive, pulsating with a dark energy that fed on fear and despair. It wasn't just a home, it was a prison, a labyrinth designed to trap souls in an endless nightmare. The revelation came when he discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Inside was a small box, covered in dust and sealed with a rusted clasp. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a collection of letters and photographs, personal mementos that told a story beyond the tapes. The letters were addressed to Amelia, written in a shaky hand that oscillated between tenderness and menace. They spoke of obsession, control, and a promise that silence will bind us forever. The photographs showed a man with cold eyes and a forced smile, Leonard Graves. Each image captured a moment of sinister intensity, a man whose presence was impossible to ignore despite his attempt to blend into the background. The letters hinted at his descent into madness, a man driven by jealousy and rage, whose stalking escalated until the apartment became a battleground for Amelia's life. His understanding deepened. Leonard Graves wasn't just a stalker, he was a puppeteer pulling strings behind the scenes, orchestrating a cycle of fear that ensnared his victims one by one. The apartment was his stage, the silence his weapon. And now, he was the next player caught in the performance. Determined to break free, he devised a plan to confront the past directly. The tapes, the letters, the hidden messages, all were pieces of a puzzle designed to expose Graves and end his reign of terror. But the closer he came to the truth, the stronger the apartment's grip became. Shadows lengthened, whispers intensified, and the cries turned into screams that echoed through the empty halls. One night, as he played the final recording, a confession from Amelia describing the stalker's final act, the room seemed to close in. The air grew thick, suffocating. The apartment's silence shattered in a cacophony of sounds, doors slamming, footsteps racing, and the unmistakable voice of Graves himself, layered over the tape with a sinister laugh. The realization hit like a thunderclap: Leonard Graves had never left. He was still here, in the apartment's shadows, a ghost tethered by his obsession, watching and waiting to complete his cycle. The silence was no longer just a void, it was the stalker's presence, alive and waiting to claim its next victim. The realization that Leonard Graves was still present, lurking invisibly within the apartment's walls, unleashed a new wave of terror that gripped him with icy fingers. It was no longer just an eerie feeling or strange noises, it was the undeniable truth that the stalker's influence had transcended death, or at least the conventional boundaries of life. Graves had become a presence, a shadow that blurred the lines between past and present, reality and nightmare. The apartment's atmosphere thickened, every breath weighed down by the oppressive silence that was no longer empty but charged with menace. The usual sounds, the distant hum of city life, the creak of old pipes, seemed drowned beneath a suffocating layer of anticipation. It was as if the building itself held its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. He found himself caught in a cycle of hyper-awareness, every creak, every whisper amplified by the knowledge that Graves was always watching, always listening. The tapes had warned him, but nothing could prepare him for the feeling of being under a microscope, every move dissected and catalogued by an unseen observer. The stalker's obsession had shifted from Amelia to him, extending the pattern like a twisted chain that bound victim to victim. Sleep became a distant memory. Nights were spent locked in a vigil, eyes darting toward the ceiling, ears straining for the faintest sound from the apartment above. The crying had evolved into a chilling lullaby, a mournful melody that twisted his emotions between pity and dread. It was Amelia's voice and something else, something deeper, older, filled with warning. Conversations with friends dwindled as he withdrew into himself. When he tried to explain, his words faltered, dismissed as paranoia or stress. The isolation deepened the stalker's grip, turning the apartment into a fortress of loneliness where the only company was the haunting presence above. In his relentless search for answers, he stumbled across a detail previously overlooked: the tenant registry for the building had been altered. Official records showed the apartment above as vacant for over a decade, yet a series of unofficial notes hinted at sporadic visitors, names crossed out or never recorded. Someone had been entering the apartment all along, erasing traces of their presence with meticulous care. This revelation shattered his assumption that the stalker was merely a ghost trapped in time. Leonard Graves, or whoever now occupied that role, was still moving freely, using the guise of vacancy to hide in plain sight. The stalking was active, ongoing. He remembered the strange footsteps he had heard, deliberate, rhythmic, and sometimes out of sync with any normal human presence. It wasn't just haunting, it was surveillance, a game of psychological chess played in the shadows. Driven by desperation, he installed discreet cameras and sound recorders in his apartment, hoping to capture evidence of the stalker's presence. The recordings were unnerving. Shadows flickered in corners where no light should reach. Voices whispered incoherently on static-laden audio. Footsteps echoed on empty stairwells. But the most chilling detail was the intermittent silence, moments when all noise ceased completely, as if the building was listening and waiting. He began to notice changes in himself. His reflection in the mirror seemed altered, eyes too wide, a face drawn tight with fear. He started keeping a journal, scribbling frantic notes about patterns in the sounds and voices, trying to map out the stalker's behavior. Each entry felt like a step deeper into the labyrinth, the walls closing in tighter with every revelation. Friends who tried to intervene found him distant and evasive, haunted by a growing conviction that speaking too much might invite the stalker's attention. The apartment had become a prison, but one built from fear and silence rather than physical bars. One evening, as he listened to a particularly disturbing tape, the voice of Leonard Graves cut through the static with unexpected clarity. It was a chilling confession, a mix of rage and twisted affection, revealing Graves' obsession with control and his belief that silence was the ultimate weapon. Graves spoke of watching, waiting, and punishing those who dared to break the cycle. The tape ended with a sinister warning: the silence never forgets. It listens. It waits for the next to fall. That night, the crying turned to screams, and the footsteps were louder, closer, pacing with a maddening regularity. The apartment seemed to warp, the walls breathing, the air thick with cold. He realized the stalker wasn't just tormenting him, he was preparing to claim him fully, to drag him into the same silence that had swallowed Amelia. Panic and determination warred inside him. Escape seemed impossible, the stalker had woven himself into every aspect of the building and his mind. But giving in was not an option. He vowed to uncover the full truth, to expose the stalker and break the chain, even if it meant confronting horrors beyond comprehension. The silence was no longer empty, it was a living entity, a predator stalking its prey in the shadows of the apartment above. The grip of fear tightened around him as days bled into nights with no relief. The apartment had become a stage where unseen forces enacted a macabre play, and he was both audience and unwilling participant. The presence above was relentless, a shadow that refused to fade, manifesting through whispered threats and cold silence. He understood now that this was not a simple haunting or a stalking by flesh and blood, it was something darker, something that fed on his unraveling sanity. The recordings had stopped being mere evidence, they were a ritual, a connection to a past he was forced to live again. Amelia's voice, fragile yet determined, echoed in his mind, her confessions a map through the twisting corridors of fear. The stalker's obsession had consumed her life, and now it sought to consume his. It was a cycle, a pattern repeating itself, like a cruel echo bouncing through time. He began to question every decision he had made since moving in. Was it coincidence, or had he been drawn here deliberately? The tapes with his name on them, the messages left beneath his floorboards, these were no accidents. Somewhere, somehow, Graves had fixed his gaze on him long before he even stepped into the building. The apartment building itself was a fortress of secrets. The walls, thin and crumbling, seemed to whisper their own stories in the dead of night. He imagined the lives of those who had come before, silent witnesses to horrors hidden behind closed doors. The locked apartment above was a tomb, but also a beacon for the darkness that lingered there. Determined to unravel the mystery, he sought out those who had known Amelia, hoping to piece together the fragments of her life. Few wanted to talk, their faces tight with fear or sorrow. A neighbor recalled the strange noises, the sudden disappearance, and the police's frustrated investigations. Another mentioned a man who had been seen loitering near the building, his presence unsettling but always dismissed as harmless. The more he learned, the clearer the pattern became. Leonard Graves was no ordinary stalker. He had cultivated a network of fear, a web spun through obsession and violence. His victims were trapped in an unbreakable cycle, silenced one by one. And the apartment above was his sanctuary, a place where the past and present collided. He realized that the stalker had adapted, evolving with each victim. Where once there had been physical threats and direct violence, now there was psychological warfare, mind games, manipulation, and a suffocating sense of being watched. The stalker had become a ghost, a presence that defied logic and law. As days passed, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. He found himself replaying the tapes obsessively, searching for clues hidden in the static and whispers. One recording revealed a chilling message, not from Amelia, but from Graves himself. The voice was calm, cold, and filled with cruel satisfaction. "You think you can escape? The silence binds us all." This sentence haunted him, embedding itself in his thoughts like a poison. The stalker wasn't just watching, he was inside his mind, planting seeds of doubt and terror. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant footstep was a reminder of the stalker's presence. The apartment was no longer a home, it was a trap. Isolation took its toll. Friends and family grew distant, unable to penetrate the wall of fear that surrounded him. His world narrowed to the confines of his apartment and the invisible prison above. The cries from the empty flat became a lullaby of despair, pulling him deeper into a spiral from which there was no easy escape. In an attempt to fight back, he started documenting everything: the sounds, the voices, the moments when the silence broke. His journal became a lifeline, a way to hold on to reality amid the encroaching darkness. Each entry was a snapshot of his unraveling mind, a record of his desperate battle against an enemy that refused to be seen. Despite the fear, a spark of defiance remained. He refused to be just another victim swallowed by the silence. There had to be a way to end this, to expose the stalker and the evil that clung to the apartment above. But to do that, he had to confront the silence directly, to step into the heart of the darkness and face whatever waited there. His plan took shape with grim determination. He would use the tapes, the hidden letters, and the recordings as weapons against Graves. If the stalker wanted a game, he would play, but on his own terms. Every whispered threat, every shadow in the corner of his vision, was fuel for the fight ahead. But the closer he came to understanding, the more the silence fought back. The apartment's shadows lengthened, stretching like tendrils that sought to ensnare him. The crying turned into pleading, and the footsteps grew erratic, as if the stalker's patience was wearing thin. The apartment was a living entity, feeding on fear and pain, and it was preparing for the final act. He knew he was running out of time. The silence was closing in, and with it, the stalker's ultimate plan. Whether it was death, madness, or something worse, he could not say. But one thing was clear: the locked apartment above held the key to everything, and he had to unlock the door before it was too late. The creeping realization that escape might be impossible settled in like a fog, thickening his thoughts and clouding every decision. The silence above was no longer just a distant echo or an occasional disturbance, it was a living, breathing force that reached deep into his soul. The apartment had become a cage, its invisible bars forged from fear and unanswered questions. His mind replayed every detail from the tapes, each confession and whispered threat intertwining to form a pattern he couldn't ignore. Leonard Graves was not only a stalker but a predator with a sinister intelligence, capable of orchestrating torment from beyond what most would consider human limits. The recordings had been his weapon, his method of control. But now, the lines blurred: was Graves still alive, or was his legacy some dark force that refused to die? He felt the weight of being observed constantly, his movements tracked, his fears fed. Even when the apartment was empty and the city noises hummed faintly outside his window, he could sense a presence lurking just beyond the veil of perception. Every shadow seemed to shift, every whisper carried a hidden message meant for him alone. Sleep became a battleground. The nights were plagued with fractured dreams, images of locked doors, muffled cries, and footsteps that echoed through empty halls. Sometimes he would wake to find himself drenched in sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the sense that something was watching from the darkness. Other times, the silence was suffocating, pressing in so heavily that he could barely breathe. The tapes had revealed more than just confessions, they held clues, pieces of a puzzle that hinted at Graves' true identity and the twisted motivations behind his crimes. A pattern emerged: Graves had been meticulous, targeting women who had tried to expose him, silencing them in a locked apartment that became his prison and his stage. But that stage was never empty. The stalker's eyes were everywhere, watching from shadows and hidden corners. He found himself drawn to the apartment above, despite the warnings etched into his mind. The locked door became an obsession. What secrets did it hide? Why was it so fiercely sealed? Every attempt to unlock its mysteries was met with resistance, not just physical barriers, but a psychological wall that threatened to unravel his sanity. His hands trembled as he traced the faded marks on the doorframe, remnants of a struggle or perhaps a desperate plea. The cold metal of the lock was unforgiving, yet the very act of touching it ignited a spark of defiance. He was no longer content to be a victim of silence and shadows. He needed answers, even if the truth was more terrifying than anything he could imagine. The tapes beneath the floorboards had led him here, each one a thread connecting his life to the woman who had died mysteriously years before. The same stalker had haunted her, and now haunted him. The realization was chilling, but it also fueled his determination. The stalker's pattern was a chain, and he was the next link. Every corner of the apartment held echoes of the past. Faint scratches on the walls, faint traces of Amelia's presence, the lingering scent of fear. It was as if the apartment itself remembered the horrors that had transpired and whispered them in the silence. The crying from above was no longer just a sound, it was a message, a warning that the past was never truly gone. He began to document everything with renewed vigor. Every noise, every shadow, every chilling detail was recorded and analyzed. The stalker's movement seemed deliberate, as if the torment was a twisted performance. But unlike Amelia, he was determined to fight back, to break free from the cycle of fear. Despite his efforts, isolation deepened. Friends grew wary, unable to understand the grip that the silent apartment held on him. His world shrank, consumed by the building's oppressive presence. Yet, within the walls of that apartment, a fierce resolve took root. He would confront the silence, face the stalker, and uncover the truth locked behind the door above. The stalking was no longer a distant memory or a ghost story, it was a living nightmare. The stalker's voice, captured on tape, haunted his waking hours with promises of eternal silence and control. But he refused to succumb. The locked apartment was a symbol, a barrier between past and present, victim and predator. Breaking through it was more than an act of courage, it was a fight for survival. The silence above was waiting, but so was he. The patterns were no longer hidden. They revealed themselves in fragments, in timing, in the chilling synchronization of past and present. The footsteps from above always happened after midnight, never before, never after. The crying always began 37 minutes past 3. Always. He began to log these events obsessively, writing them down with timestamps, building what resembled a map of fear. But this wasn't paranoia. It was design. Someone, or something, was scripting this torment with precision. The psychological grip of the apartment deepened as he realized he was not discovering these things by accident. He was meant to. He was supposed to find the tapes. He was supposed to hear Amelia's voice. He was supposed to follow the same trail that had led her to her doom. It was a setup from the beginning, only this time, the rules had changed. The predator wasn't just hiding in the walls. He was adapting, evolving, watching every move. The idea that someone could remain hidden for years inside a New York building seemed implausible. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Amelia's case had been ruled a mystery because the apartment had been locked from the inside, the window sealed, the hallway camera showing no one entering or leaving. Her death had baffled police. But it hadn't baffled her. She'd known. The tapes proved it. She had recorded her fear, left behind a trail, not as a cry for help, but as a trap for whoever came next. A desperate hope that someone would understand what was really happening. And he did. Because it was happening again. The presence in the apartment no longer felt residual. It didn't just mimic life. It responded. When he turned off the lights, it turned them back on. When he whispered into the recorder, a whisper echoed seconds later from the floor above. When he locked his door, he would find it ajar the next morning. It wasn't just supernatural, it was intelligent. The deeper he dug, the more he became convinced that Graves had created something far beyond stalking. He had created a psychological virus. The tapes were not just evidence, they were the infection. Listening to them had started the cycle. Just as Graves' voice had poisoned Amelia's thoughts, it was now inside his own mind. Every syllable replayed involuntarily, echoing through his memory with venomous clarity. There were moments when he questioned his own reality. Objects moved subtly, almost mockingly. Doors that should have creaked were soundless, as if the building conspired to conceal its movements. The old elevator stalled on his floor too often, humming low like a warning. His phone rang at odd hours, only to reveal static on the other end. Always the same number. Always untraceable. The entity, whether it was Graves himself or some haunting legacy, thrived on obsession. The more he searched, the more it embedded itself. The more he tried to expose it, the more it camouflaged, shifting shape, shifting method. He was beginning to realize it didn't want to kill him the way it had killed Amelia. Not immediately. It wanted to unravel him piece by piece. To wear him down until he doubted his own senses. Until he voluntarily gave in to the silence above. It wasn't just about hearing footsteps anymore. It was about becoming part of them. The hallucinations, or whatever they were, intensified. At night, he would see figures standing at the end of the hallway, unmoving, faceless. Sometimes, he'd wake up to faint breathing that wasn't his own. Once, he swore he saw someone staring back at him from the bathroom mirror, not behind him, but inside it, as if the reflection had become a window into somewhere else. What made it worse was how easily the world outside seemed indifferent. No one believed the stories. Neighbors dismissed the noises. The building super, when confronted, showed genuine fear but said nothing, only muttering that apartment 6B should have stayed sealed. No matter who he tried to talk to, friends, coworkers, even a private investigator, they eventually pulled away. They didn't want to be involved. Something about this mystery repelled outsiders, like a defense mechanism built into the horror itself. Even online forums offered little comfort. Others had posted about similar hauntings in the same area, some dating back decades, but the posts were always abruptly deleted, the usernames vanished. One user had even shared a photo of a cassette labeled Graves number 7 before their account went dark. When he reached out, the message bounced. Gone. Erased. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a containment. A system designed to perpetuate itself in silence. One person at a time. And now, he was the current host. The locked apartment above was no longer just a source of fear, it was the heart of the infection. Whatever was behind that door wasn't just memory or spirit or trauma. It was hunger. It needed attention, and once it had yours, it never let go. It studied your mind, learned your patterns, and molded your terror into something it could use. You didn't just live with it. You became part of it. And it was growing bolder. He started keeping the lights on, not because he believed it would keep him safe, but because the darkness had learned how to mimic the familiar. Shapes in the shadows resembled people. The corners of the room stretched further than they should have. The air seemed denser at night, like he was sinking slowly into something invisible. His sleep became fragmented, interrupted by phantom touches and sounds that lingered just at the edge of clarity. The silence above, once eerily still, had turned into something deliberate, calculated periods of noise, then quiet, as though it were listening back. He began to piece together the routines. The haunting was never random. It was built on rhythm, on ritual. A shuffle of footsteps at 12:03. The faint drag of something across the ceiling at 2:11. The cry, always that soft, low, agonizing cry, at exactly 3:37. Every night. Without fail. The pattern didn't deviate unless he left the apartment, and even then, he would receive a reminder. A voicemail of static. A blurred reflection in a storefront window. A cassette that had not been there before suddenly appearing in his coat pocket. The apartment above him didn't just want to be acknowledged. It wanted to follow. The tapes started to change. The first batch had been journal-like recordings, Amelia documenting the stalker's behaviors and her increasing paranoia. But the ones he discovered next were different. They spoke directly to him. Not in a figurative sense, literally. His name. His habits. His thoughts, repeated word for word, as if someone had been recording him long before he ever found the first tape. He'd sit frozen, listening to a voice that sounded like Amelia's but also distorted, warped by something not quite human. The voice talked about him walking into the kitchen, about him staring into the hallway mirror. It described what he was wearing. Sometimes, it predicted what he would do next. And when he tested it, changed his plans on a whim, the voice would correct itself the next day, always one step behind, never off for long. He began to realize that the haunting wasn't rooted in space. It was temporal. Whatever was up there could bend the idea of time. The recordings weren't from the past. They were from now. Or from tomorrow. Or from a version of him that no longer existed. Maybe it was never about Amelia. Maybe she was just the first one to notice, the first one to document it. And now that he had taken her place, he had become the next chapter in a looping, living nightmare. The building's layout started to feel unfamiliar. Doors didn't lead where they used to. One night, he walked down to the basement and came back up to find his hallway inverted, apartment numbers reversed, furniture slightly off. It was only by opening his own door and seeing the worn mark on the floor where his coffee table had scraped the wood that he convinced himself it was still his place. But even then, he wasn't sure. Mirrors in the bathroom reflected angles that didn't exist. A camera left recording overnight caught nothing but static and warping shadows, even when objects visibly moved. He couldn't document it. Every attempt at evidence erased itself or came back distorted beyond recognition. Even his own memories began to decay. He found himself forgetting basic things, passwords, names, what day it was. He once forgot his own face, standing in front of the mirror for 10 full minutes, unable to recognize the man looking back. He called his brother to ask if he'd always had a scar on his eyebrow. His brother, confused, said no. He'd never had one. But there it was. A long, thin, pale line that hadn't been there a month ago. His apartment was changing him. Or maybe it was rewriting him. Every tape he listened to felt like a line added to a script he didn't know he was following. His journal entries stopped feeling like his own thoughts. Some were written in handwriting that looked almost identical to Amelia's. His dreams started blending with hers, or with the ones described on the older tapes. They involved rooms that shouldn't exist, conversations he never had, doors he wasn't supposed to open. And always, in the background, the soft whisper of someone saying his name, dragging it out like a question that demanded an answer. There was no longer any clear distinction between what was real and what wasn't. But one truth remained undeniable: something was orchestrating all of this. Something was feeding off the confusion, the erosion of identity. It wasn't chaos. It was control. The apartment wasn't just haunted. It was sentient. And it had learned how to use people like vessels, like shells, to carry its infection into the world. Amelia had tried to contain it with the tapes. But now, the tapes were spreading again. He had become the carrier. He no longer believed escape was possible. Leaving the apartment might stop the footsteps, might silence the crying for a while. But it wouldn't change the fact that it was already inside him. Whatever watched from the ceiling, whatever waited in the spaces between breaths, it knew him now. It had chosen him. The cycle had begun again. The next tape would not be something he found. It would be something someone else found, long after he was gone. And his voice would be on it. He started seeing people he didn't recognize, brief flashes of unfamiliar faces in mirrors, behind fogged glass, or in the periphery of his vision. They never stayed long enough to be identified, but they always stared directly at him. In elevators, his reflection would be delayed by a split second, like the mirror was thinking before it responded. Sometimes, it wasn't even his reflection that appeared. He once looked into the hallway mirror and saw a woman standing behind him, hands pressed to his shoulders, face drained of all color. But when he turned around, no one was there. The hallway was empty, but the cold sensation remained where her hands had been. The apartment wasn't just affecting his sense of time and identity, it was warping his understanding of presence. Even his neighbors began to act differently. They became distant, like actors who had been given new roles but hadn't rehearsed enough to make them believable. The old man who used to nod in passing now stared blankly as if he didn't recognize him. A woman who always complained about her leaking faucet suddenly acted like she'd never lived in the building. And when he brought it up to the landlord, the man looked confused and asked what woman he was talking about. The records showed the apartment had been vacant for over a year. He knew then that the infection was spreading beyond the walls. It was reaching into the minds of those nearby, rewriting memories, altering facts. He noticed an odd pattern in the tapes, certain phrases repeated across them, regardless of who was speaking. Words like spiral, echo, and return kept surfacing, like linguistic parasites. Even tapes from different eras, different voices, repeated them. It didn't matter whether they were from Amelia or others who had lived in the building before her. The phrases were planted, seeded into each message like a code or a trigger. He started writing them down, trying to make sense of them, arranging them like puzzle pieces, but the more he did, the more they began to appear in his own thoughts uninvited. He'd find himself muttering them without meaning to, as if his mind had become an extension of the tapes. The apartment's influence was no longer limited to sound or sensation. Physical changes were happening. The walls seemed to breathe sometimes, ever so slightly expanding and contracting when the room was silent. Once, he swore the doorknob melted slightly beneath his touch, only for a moment, then reformed. He marked the doorframe with a knife, but the scratches disappeared the next morning. His food spoiled faster. The air tasted metallic. The water smelled like rust, no matter how many times maintenance came to check it. He started losing weight despite eating the same. It wasn't hunger he was feeling, it was a draining, like something was feeding off him while he slept. His phone calls to friends began ending with static and unintelligible whispers. Texts he never sent appeared in his outbox. Emails from dead inboxes arrived with subject lines that simply said, "Listen." One message contained only an audio clip. It was 5 seconds long. The sound was a distorted echo of his own voice saying, "It's already here." He never remembered recording that. He deleted it, but it came back the next day, this time at the end of a voicemail left by an unknown number. He started testing his own reality. Writing timestamps on mirrors. Setting alarms to go off during moments he thought might be altered. He'd wake up in a different shirt than he wore to bed. His keys would appear in places he never left them. Once, he found a pair of shoes by the door, worn, muddy, and 2 sizes too large. He didn't own them. They disappeared by morning. He began to suspect he wasn't the only one living in his apartment anymore. Maybe he never had been. The sound from above had evolved. It wasn't just footsteps or crying now. It was murmuring. Voices layered over each other, as if people were conversing in reverse. He tried recording them, but the audio files were blank or corrupted. The one time he caught something clear, it was a woman whispering his name, followed by a low male voice repeating the word again over and over until the recording cut off. He threw the recorder away, but another appeared the next day on his desk, same model, same message. That was the night he stopped trying to document anything. It wasn't evidence anymore. It was bait. He thought about the woman from the tapes, Amelia. How her voice started as fearful, then resigned, then eerily calm toward the end. He understood now. It wasn't madness. It was surrender. There came a point when you stopped fighting because the thing you were resisting was no longer outside you. It had entered you, mapped itself over your thoughts, spoken through your mouth, dreamed inside your skull. He wasn't losing himself. He was becoming something else. The building had always been like this. Amelia wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. It was never about death or ghosts. It was about replication. The apartment above was a mirror. Not a reflection of what was, but what would be. Everyone who lived below eventually heard the footsteps. Everyone found the tapes. Everyone thought they were investigating something. But in truth, they were being rewritten. Bit by bit. Until they forgot they ever were someone else. And then, the cycle would begin again. There was no denying it anymore. The apartment had rules, unwritten, unspoken, but ruthlessly enforced. Every time he deviated from his routine, something responded. If he left the lights on overnight, he'd wake up to find them flickering, buzzing with voices just out of range. If he tried to sleep during the day, the noise from the floor above would start, not footsteps now, but dragging. As if furniture, or something heavier, was being moved in slow circles. The apartment wanted patterns. Predictable rhythms. Repetition. It wanted him to fall in line with a loop he didn't even realize he was following. He began to question every decision, wondering if it was his or if he was being pushed toward it. When he took a different route home one evening, he found himself back on his usual block without realizing how. The city had always been a grid, easy to navigate, but now it folded, rerouted, hid details. Street names disappeared from signs. Familiar buildings were replaced with ones he didn't remember. He called an old friend to verify a memory about a night out years ago, only to be told they'd never met in that place. His past was being shaved down, reworked, modified to fit the narrative the apartment had designed for him. He started hearing a new sound at night, a low, rhythmic knocking. Not on the walls or the ceiling, but from inside the floor beneath his bed. It was too measured to be natural, too purposeful to be ignored. It knocked in groups of 3, then stopped. Sometimes it repeated the pattern. Sometimes it didn't. When he stayed completely still and counted along, it stopped instantly. As if acknowledging his awareness and adjusting accordingly. One night he tapped back, just once. The reply was immediate, 3 loud knocks, stronger than ever. He never responded again. He came across a new tape, one he had not seen before. Unlike the others, it had no label. It was inside an envelope marked only with today's date. The handwriting matched his own. It contained a message, but not a confession. It was a future recording, his own voice, panicked and pleading, describing events that hadn't yet happened. He spoke about trying to leave, about doors that led back into the same hallway, about time looping in 5-minute increments. It ended with him screaming that someone else was inside his body. He threw the tape away, but the next morning, he woke up with the envelope in his hands again. His sense of time began to fracture. Days didn't end normally. Mornings came too soon or too late. The sun sometimes set in minutes. Clocks throughout the apartment disagreed with each other. His phone would display 3:03 a.m. for hours, then jump to noon without warning. He recorded videos of himself, hoping to document proof, but the recordings would either vanish or show him doing something else entirely, like sitting silently in the dark, staring directly into the lens. In one, he whispered something repeatedly, something he couldn't understand until he slowed it down and reversed it, let him in. Voices started coming through the vents. They weren't always coherent, sometimes just syllables and breath, but occasionally, full sentences broke through. A woman cried softly, whispering that she couldn't see anymore. A man begged to be remembered. Another voice, distant but unmistakably familiar, warned him that the apartment was a machine, and that it required participants. It didn't haunt people. It recruited them. Each person drawn into its web played a role, and eventually, their identity was absorbed. It was a living archive of the forgotten, turning memory into structure, thought into material, and pain into fuel. He started feeling watched even in sleep. Dreams became heavy, looping sequences of corridors and tape decks, always leading back to his own apartment. He dreamed of doors opening by themselves and rooms that didn't exist during the day. In some dreams, he was Amelia, running from something he couldn't see. In others, he was watching himself through a static-ridden camera feed, unable to move or speak, forced to observe his own unraveling. Waking up offered no relief. His body ached in ways that suggested he'd been physically active all night, even though he hadn't moved from his bed. He found a notebook with his handwriting inside, but he had no memory of writing it. Each page described daily observations, his movements, his meals, even his dreams. As he flipped further, the entries became more ominous, warning him not to trust the mirrors, not to speak his name out loud, not to answer the phone after 2:33 a.m. The last entry simply read, "He's almost ready." There was no signature, no date. He tried burning it, but the flames wouldn't catch. The pages refused to blacken, curling at the edges before returning to their original state. He remembered a story he once read, about a man who lived inside a painting. Over time, the man forgot he was once real, believing the boundaries of the canvas were the edges of the world. That story suddenly felt uncomfortably close to home. He wondered if that's what the apartment was, a frame. A loop. A trap designed not to keep people out, but to keep someone in. Someone like him. And somewhere above him, always just out of reach, the footsteps resumed. The sounds from the apartment above became more precise. No longer erratic, no longer confused in timing or tone. They arrived exactly at 3:17 a.m. every night, 3 slow footsteps, a faint sob, then complete silence. No more dragging, no voices. It was as if whatever had been stirring above had shifted from chaos to ritual. Something was being rehearsed, played back, repeated with intention. Each night was the same, no variation. He tried recording it, but the audio was always blank, dead air between timestamps, even when his own ears had clearly registered the sound. He started to believe the apartment was editing reality, not just what he experienced, but what the world allowed him to prove. Mirrors became unreliable. Reflections lagged a split second behind, enough to notice but not enough to explain to anyone else. Sometimes they didn't show him at all, only the room, empty and sterile. Once, he stared at the bathroom mirror for over an hour. His reflection stared back, never blinking. When he finally blinked, the reflection didn't. It just stood there, watching him until he left. From then on, he covered all the mirrors. But even hidden, they seemed to hum softly behind the fabric, like they were breathing. It became harder to determine which memories were real. He recalled a phone call with his mother, but she didn't remember it. He could describe the entire conversation in vivid detail, what she said, what he was doing, even background noises. But when he tried to play the call from his phone history, it simply didn't exist. Entire chunks of his past felt edited. Familiar photos in his phone gallery now contained subtle differences, different clothes, different expressions, and in one, a person he didn't recognize standing in the background, their face turned toward the camera. When he zoomed in, the image corrupted instantly. He stopped leaving the apartment. Not out of fear, but because whenever he tried, he found himself right back inside. He'd take the elevator to the lobby, but when the doors opened, it was his hallway again. He walked down the stairs only to find they spiraled, doubling back into the same floor. The outside world began to feel like a memory someone else had fed him. The skyline through the windows looked off, slightly warped, like a 3D rendering with bad perspective. He tried opening the front door while someone was knocking on it, only to find no one there, and behind him, a second knock coming from inside the apartment. The temperature began to fluctuate without warning. It would drop to freezing without the heater running, and moments later, the heat would rise to unbearable levels. The thermostat stopped responding. The apartment had developed its own climate, cycling through discomfort as if testing his endurance. At times, a scent would appear, old perfume, mildew, burning hair, then vanish in seconds. It was never random. It always accompanied a memory, a whisper of something half-forgotten, coaxing him into remembering things he wasn't sure he had lived. He no longer needed to sleep. The apartment refused to allow it. If he dozed off, he'd wake up feeling as if he'd been awake the entire time, with no sense of rest, no dreams, only the echo of soft whispers speaking backwards. Once, he recorded his sleep using a motion-triggered camera. The footage showed him sitting up in bed at 3:17 a.m., eyes wide open, speaking in a voice not his own. He couldn't hear what he was saying because the audio was layered, his voice buried beneath static, and beneath that, another voice entirely. The floor plan of the apartment began to shift. Walls extended. A closet he had always known to be shallow now opened into a narrow hallway. That hallway curved unnaturally and ended in a locked door he had never seen. The light switch in the kitchen now controlled the hallway lamp. Small changes, each designed to test his grip on space. He made diagrams. Measured corners. Took notes. But every morning, the measurements changed. The rooms did not want to be mapped. In one of the kitchen cabinets, hidden behind the backing, he found a crumpled page with handwriting identical to his. It read, "You are not the first. You are not the last. Don't listen to the man in the hallway." There had never been a man in the hallway. Until now. That night, just past 3 a.m., he heard breathing outside his door. Slow, calm, patient. Not approaching, not retreating. Just waiting. He had stopped receiving messages from anyone. Texts, emails, even spam, gone. It was as if his digital presence had been disconnected. Social media accounts deactivated themselves. His phone contacts were empty. When he dialed numbers manually, the calls didn't go through, only a looping tone that sounded more like a human exhale than a machine signal. He no longer received deliveries. No neighbors passed in the hallway. The building had hollowed out, leaving only him and the apartment and the thing above that watched. Then one morning, he woke up with a new key in his hand. It was old, brass, marked with the number 5C, the unit above. The one that had been locked for 12 years. The key was cold. Not the natural cold of metal, but something deeper, older, like it had been hidden in soil or submerged in water for a long time. Its teeth were jagged, not like a standard apartment key, almost handmade. It didn't match any key he'd seen used in the building. And yet it clearly belonged to the door above. Marked 5C, its presence in his palm raised more questions than answers. He had no memory of where it came from or how it got there. He hadn't left the apartment. No one had entered. Still, there it was, resting on his palm like a verdict already passed. He didn't use the key immediately. For days, it sat on his kitchen counter, always in the exact same spot, even when he moved it. If he placed it in a drawer, it would be back on the counter the next time he turned around. He even tried throwing it out the window. It landed with a soft metallic clink behind him minutes later, as if time had folded around it and handed it back. It wasn't just a key. It was an invitation, or worse, a demand. And the apartment was making it very clear, he was expected to accept. The noises from above changed. No more footsteps. No more crying. Just the sound of something shifting across the floorboard slowly, like heavy furniture dragging itself an inch at a time. And the creaking aligned with his movements, as if whatever was up there mirrored his every step. When he stood still, it stood still. When he walked from room to room, so did it. And when he whispered, sometimes he could hear the exact words whispered back with the tiniest delay. The ceiling had become a mouth that echoed him. Not a wall between spaces, but a layer between two minds. He began to see shadows moving in places where light didn't fall. Hallways that should have been pitch black still revealed shifting outlines, tall, thin, jerking slightly like someone trying to remember how to move like a human. And sometimes, when he stared too long into those shadows, they stared back. Not with eyes, but with presence. A pressure behind his ribs, a prickling sensation on the nape of his neck, like his spine recognized something his brain couldn't articulate. The air had weight now. Breathing felt like dragging in dust and fog. Lights flickered more frequently, but always in rhythm, 5 blinks, a pause, then 5 more. He checked the fuse box. Perfectly functional. Replaced bulbs. Still the pattern returned. 5 flashes. 5. Like a code. Or a countdown. Or a room number. The apartment was no longer just behaving strangely, it was communicating, learning how to use the environment to speak. On his walls, faint writing began to appear under the paint. Only visible at certain angles, like old pencil scratches on pages torn out of a diary. The sentences didn't make sense, and they weren't complete. One said, "You look different when you sleep." Another, "He's still hungry. You're not enough." And the most chilling, "You were supposed to stop this." The words faded whenever he touched them. But more would appear later. Always more. Always more questions, never answers. He began having brief memory blackouts. He'd be brushing his teeth and suddenly find himself standing at the front door, key in hand. Or he'd wake up sitting cross-legged in front of the ceiling, staring at the plaster, mouth dry, eyes burning, no memory of how long he'd been like that. His body had started acting with a will of its own, compelled by something else. Or someone else. And deep down, he feared he wasn't resisting anymore. He feared he was obeying. The apartment's layout shifted again. This time, a small door appeared behind his refrigerator. Just 4 feet high, it had hinges so old they looked fossilized. He tried opening it, but it wouldn't budge. Later that night, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, darkness that didn't reflect light. He dropped a flashlight in, and the beam didn't return. It swallowed the light whole, like a mouth swallowing a scream. That door remained open now, waiting, pulsing slightly like it breathed. The key began to feel heavier each day. Not metaphorically, physically. He weighed it once. 10 ounces. Then 12. Then a full pound. It shouldn't be possible, but nothing here followed rules anymore. The key was growing with purpose, with gravity, demanding attention. Something was building toward a moment, and he felt like a thread being wound into it. No longer a bystander. He was becoming the final act. On the 12th night after discovering the key, he awoke to find the floor between his bed and the apartment door marked with muddy footprints. Bare feet. Thin. Long toes. Each step placed deliberately, leading from the bedroom to the front door, and back again. But they weren't his. His feet were clean, dry. And the mud, they were on the 24th floor of a sealed building. There was no mud outside. That morning, the ceiling above his bed developed a crack. Small at first, then widening each hour. It wasn't from structural damage. It was too clean, too intentional, splitting in a perfect arc. He stood underneath it, and for a moment, he swore he could see light coming through it, not daylight, but something darker, like the glint of an eye behind a peephole. Watching. Always watching. And still, the key sat on the counter. Waiting. Sleep no longer came like it used to. When it did, it came in fragments, jagged pieces of unconsciousness littered with flashes of unknown faces, labyrinthine corridors, and the ever-present sense that someone stood just behind him. In dreams, the walls breathed. The floor pulsed. And the ceiling opened, revealing not sky, not wood, but a gaping mouth of silence that threatened to consume him whole. When he woke, he was never refreshed, only more aware of how close everything felt. Not just the building, but the history, the memory, the echo of something old and unfinished. The crack in the ceiling now ran from corner to corner. It didn't follow gravity, or wood grain, or architectural design. It moved with intention. It avoided lights and always grew when he wasn't looking. Beneath it, flakes of plaster would fall in silence, landing on his pillow like soft white ash. And yet, despite its ominous presence, it never fully broke. It stayed there, taunting him, threatening to open, but never quite doing so. Like something on the other side wasn't ready. Or was waiting for him to be ready. The radio static had returned. But this time, it wasn't on any device. It was in the air. A low-frequency hum, almost imperceptible unless you stood perfectly still. Then it would rise, layered with faint whispers and occasional clicks. He tried recording it, but his devices would either shut down or capture only dead silence. But he knew it was there. The kind of knowing that bypasses ears and eyes and sits in your gut like a knot tightening by the hour. He hadn't left the apartment in over a week. Time became elastic, morning and night indistinguishable. The light from the windows never felt right. Sometimes the sun would rise too early. Other times, it wouldn't rise at all. He suspected the outside world still existed, but it no longer applied to him. Not fully. Not while he lived in the boundary between stories, the thin place between memory and haunting, where the past hung in the air like mist that wouldn't lift. He reviewed the tapes again. Every word. Every breath. Each confession a piece of a puzzle he could no longer pretend to ignore. The woman from 5C had known her stalker well, too well. She had documented every message, every knock, every shadow under her door. And then, in the final tape, she had spoken a name. His name. Not just the same first name. His full name. Clear, without hesitation. Like she had always known he would be next. Or perhaps he had already been there, long before she died. He tried to rationalize it, but there was no logic that held. He wasn't related to her. Had never met her. Had only moved into the building this year. And yet, her voice in that recording was calm. Not panicked. Not confused. Calm, and almost sad. Like she knew she wouldn't survive, but that her words might reach him when it was his turn. And the more he listened, the more he felt her presence, not as a ghost, but as a remnant of someone who had tried everything to warn the next victim. The mirror in his bathroom had started reflecting strange angles. Objects behind him would appear closer than they were. Sometimes, people. A figure in the background, just for a second, too tall to be human, too still to be alive. When he turned, nothing. But the image would remain in his mind's eye, burned in with such clarity that he could remember details, a hand pressed to the wall, long fingers, pale skin, a mouth that looked like it had been sewn shut. He didn't clean the mirror anymore. Smudges would form in the shape of prints. Sometimes his. Sometimes not. One morning, written in the fog from his shower, a sentence appeared, "You're in the wrong place." He wiped it away, but it reappeared every time he looked at the mirror. Same words. Same slanted handwriting. Until one day, the message changed. "You're exactly where he wants you." The feeling of being watched had become constant. Not the metaphorical kind. Not paranoia. A true sensation, like heat on the back of his neck, or a finger tracing the air just behind his shoulder. It grew stronger near the walls. Stronger near the floorboards under the bed. Strongest near the ceiling. And the worst part was the sense of familiarity. As if whatever watched him wasn't foreign at all. As if it had always been with him. Long before the apartment. Long before New York. Maybe long before memory itself. He didn't know how long he'd been awake. Days bled into each other. Meals went uneaten. Voices whispered from power outlets, beneath tiles, behind vents. And yet he couldn't leave. The door wouldn't open, not stuck, just unwilling. The key, which once sat cold and heavy on the counter, was now missing. In its place, a simple message had been etched into the wood, "It's time to come upstairs." The apartment above had remained silent for 3 days. No footsteps. No dragging. No crying. Only stillness. But it was the loudest silence he'd ever heard. The kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums. That filled lungs. That replaced thought? It wasn't absence. It was anticipation. The building had gone still not because the haunting was over, but because something was waiting. He didn't know what he would find if he ascended. But he knew this, the story wasn't hers anymore. It had always been his. The silence had changed. It wasn't merely stillness anymore, it had become sentient. It felt like something aware was listening back. Every breath he took felt borrowed, as if he were disturbing the air of something that didn't want to be touched. The walls had ceased creaking. The usual thrum of pipes, distant horns, and city ambience had entirely vanished. The building had taken a breath in and was holding it, waiting to see if he would move. He no longer trusted the floor beneath him. Walking from room to room became a negotiation with the boards, each step met with the risk of drawing attention to himself. The crack in the ceiling had widened, almost imperceptibly, but the shift in air pressure beneath it was noticeable. Cold drafts bled downward, making his skin prickle. He had stopped sleeping altogether, afraid of what might happen while unconscious. The apartment no longer behaved like an apartment, it acted like a trap disguised as a home. The tape recorders had begun playing on their own. He'd wake, if sleep ever claimed him at all, to the soft, warped playback of voices not his own. At first, it was the woman's confessions again, looping over themselves, skipping, glitching in and out. But then came the new voices. Ones that hadn't been on the tapes before. Male voices. Breathing, whispering, speaking his name. Always his name. Sometimes from the corner of the room. Sometimes from under the floor. And once, unmistakably, from inside the vent by his bed. He tried covering the vent, sealing it with cardboard and tape, but the next morning the seal would be ripped open, and the words, "Don't look down," would be written inside, scratched in the dust. He had tried looking, of course. Curiosity and fear working hand in hand. But all he ever saw was darkness, and something he could only describe as movement. Not fast. Not violent. Just the suggestion that something aware of him was also trying very hard not to be seen. He could feel the architecture shifting now. The apartment was no longer spatially consistent. A hallway he knew was 6 steps long became 10. The bathroom mirror sometimes reflected a version of the room that was subtly wrong, missing furniture, different shadows, slightly altered wallpaper that he never remembered choosing. There were versions of his reflection that didn't blink in sync with him. One time, it smiled. He didn't. He had stopped checking his phone days ago. The messages were meaningless strings of numbers, repeated words, timestamps that didn't make sense. Once, at 3:33 a.m., he received a video with no sender. It showed his own apartment door from the hallway. The footage was shaky, as if taken by someone breathing heavily, struggling to stay still. The video ended with the camera turning toward the ceiling above his door, showing a faint outline of a hand reaching out from a crack that wasn't supposed to be there. When he looked, the ceiling above his door was intact. But only until night fell. The smell returned next, a subtle rot that didn't seem to come from decay, but from memory itself. As if the building was remembering what had been buried. The scent was strongest near the floor vents and under his bed. He considered moving furniture to block the space, but he understood deep down it would make no difference. It wasn't a physical presence anymore, it was something in the very grain of the wood, in the dust of the air, in the blood memory of the walls. He'd found another tape. Not under the floor, not hidden in the closet, but inside his pillow. As if it had grown there. Unlike the others, this one had no label, no handwriting. When he played it, there was no voice. Just breathing. Familiar. Labored. And then, after nearly 6 minutes of silence, a whisper, "You've been here before." He dropped the tape. Let it spin. The whisper repeated, "You left last time. You won't again." The memories he thought were dreams started feeling like something else. He began remembering a place that felt identical to this one, but from years ago. A fire escape he recognized but didn't know. A room layout he could navigate with his eyes closed, even though he'd never lived there before. He began to suspect that he wasn't the first to live this loop. That perhaps he had lived it before. That maybe, this time, he had chosen to return. The woman's tapes were never hers alone. Some were made before her. Some felt older. And some, he realized with rising dread, were made after. The recordings seemed to stretch across time like cracks in glass, refracting a single event across different lives. They were not a journal. They were a cycle. A repeating scream in a building that had learned to trap echoes. Each tenant was another verse in a song of obsession and surveillance. He started to notice how the furniture wasn't his. Not really. Small changes began to reveal themselves. A drawer that opened the wrong way. A chair leg that was a slightly different color. A book with handwriting in the margins, his own, but older. The more he tried to remember where he bought these things, the less sure he became. The apartment was reconstructing itself to match a version of him he hadn't yet become. And now, the knocking had returned. Not above. Below. A slow, deliberate tapping from beneath the floorboards. It followed him from room to room. It knew where he stood. It knocked when he hesitated. And then, one night, it paused, and knocked in rhythm with his heartbeat. The ceiling above him no longer cracked. It pulsed. And something up there was listening, waiting for him to come home again. He no longer measured time in hours or days. Time had become an emotional state, fluid, stifling, and endless. The clocks in the apartment had started slowing down. Then they sped up. Then they stopped altogether. One digital alarm began displaying unreadable symbols, flickering in a loop, before dying completely. It was no longer about what day it was. It was about what the apartment decided he should feel. Sleep was no longer a refuge. When he closed his eyes, he didn't dream. He remembered. Moments that weren't his life, but could have been. A different woman in the mirror. A stalker's silhouette standing across the street every night. Doors that wouldn't open unless you whispered the right name. The dreams were like flashes from the lives of others who had once stepped into this same corridor of dread, and had never stepped out again. He saw the woman from 12 years ago watching herself in the mirror, whispering confessions into her tape recorder. He saw her lock the door. He saw her speak to someone who was never seen but always present. And every time he reached the part where she died, he woke up gasping, because this time, the dream was from her perspective. Something inside the apartment had started mimicking him. At first, it was harmless. He'd set his coffee mug on the table and moments later hear the same sound repeated elsewhere. He'd cough and then hear it echoed from behind the walls. But it grew worse. He'd get up from bed and hear footsteps matching his own just slightly out of sync. Sometimes breathing aligned with his, and then deliberately fell out of rhythm, as if reminding him it wasn't coming from his chest. The apartment had begun reflecting him, mocking him, mirroring him like a funhouse with no exit. The floor beneath his bed had changed texture. Walking barefoot revealed that the grain of the wood pulsed slightly under pressure, like flesh with a heartbeat. He stopped stepping on it. Then he realized it didn't matter, because one morning, the same pulsing sensation was in the tiles of his kitchen, and then on the bathroom walls. The apartment was not only alive, it was becoming aware that he was aware. And it hated being seen. He had tried to leave once more. The door unlocked, the hallway stood still, the elevator arrived. But the descent never ended. The numbers on the screen froze at 4. The lights dimmed. And when the doors opened again, he was staring at his own hallway. Not a replica. The exact hallway. Same scratch on the floor. Same dent in the wall. Only this time, the light above his door flickered in a pattern that resembled Morse code. He didn't know Morse. But he knew a warning when he saw it. He began to feel eyes. Not the human kind. Not the kind attached to faces or expressions. These were older. Cold. They observed without judgment, yet with purpose. He couldn't explain how he knew. But there were moments he stood in the middle of his apartment and could feel 4, maybe 5, points of attention locked onto him from multiple directions. None of them blinked. None of them moved. But they were there, pressing against his skin like weightless hands. On the kitchen wall, behind a poorly painted section near the cabinets, he found another anomaly. A patch that seemed newer. He peeled it back slowly, only to reveal words scratched into the drywall beneath. Over and over, the same sentence: "If you found this, it's already too late." Some of the lines were older. Some were fresh. He had not written them. But they were in his handwriting. The tape recorder started playing by itself again, even after being unplugged and having the batteries removed. A voice came through, this time clearer than ever before. It was not the woman. It was not him. It was something else entirely. Genderless, devoid of emotion, yet intimate. It said, "You brought yourself back here." And then silence. Until it continued, "We only ever reflect what's already broken." He opened the closet where he had stored all the old tapes. Every single cassette now had a label. But the labels didn't make sense. Some said dates that hadn't come yet. Others referenced moments that hadn't happened. One said, "Your last morning." Another said, "The time you tried to scream." They weren't memories. They were predictions. He tried destroying one. Snapped it in two and threw the remains into the sink. The moment he did, the lights flickered violently and every faucet in the apartment turned on. Water gushed without warning, soaking the floors. The sound that came from the pipes wasn't water, it was screaming. Screaming in reverse, as though pulled backward into silence. He unplugged everything, shut off the valves. The water stopped. But from then on, when he turned the lights on, shadows waited for him. Not his. Taller. Crooked. Slightly out of place. One night, while sitting in absolute darkness, he felt a breath on his neck that didn't come from him. A voice whispered, not through the room, but inside his head. It said only this: 24. And then, he understood. Each day in the apartment was not a day. It was a chapter. A sequence. A ritual. And he was now on the 24th turn of something ancient and unfinished. The apartment was not haunted. It was rehearsing. And now, it was time to begin again. There was no longer any way to mark the passing of night or day. The windows still faced the city skyline, but what lay beyond the glass didn't behave like New York anymore. The view showed lights, far too many and far too bright for any realistic hour. Sometimes there was movement, a blur of shapes like figures walking, but never clearly defined. The skyline itself had begun to shift. Once, he could see the Empire State Building from his bedroom. Now, it was gone. In its place, a tall, thin tower with no windows, dark and pulsing faintly like a beacon. Every morning, it was just a little closer. The tapes had started duplicating. He would find new ones stacked neatly beside his bed, labeled with times he had never remembered recording. When he played them, he heard himself whispering, murmuring about things he didn't know he had experienced. Some of the recordings were filled with silence, occasionally broken by distant sounds of footsteps or indistinct muttering. But some had static that resolved into voices calling his name. Not once. Not in greeting. Repeating. Begging. Sometimes chanting. He began noticing more items around the apartment that didn't belong to him. A red scarf draped over the back of the chair in the corner. A set of silver keys he had never used. A book open to the middle, with no title or author, just a list of names, one of which was his. Others were names he didn't recognize, but he began finding those names carved into the floorboards, hidden behind pictures, etched faintly into the bathroom mirror. Every name had a date next to it. All but his. His space was still blank. Strangers started calling his phone. Not the usual robocalls or wrong numbers. These were people who knew too much. A man once called and said, "I saw what you did to her." Another said, "You need to leave. But you can't use the door." The worst was a child's voice asking, "Are you ready for your ending?" None of these numbers were traceable. None ever called twice. There was no silence anymore. Even when he turned off every device, sealed the windows, and lay in total darkness, the apartment whispered. Not in words, just in intentions. It made the walls creak in Morse-like intervals. It made the floors hum at different frequencies depending on where he stepped. He began writing these vibrations down, convinced it was a code. After weeks of trying to decipher it, the pattern translated to just one phrase: "She heard you." At the heart of it all was the woman who died 12 years ago. He knew her name now. He had found it written behind the mirror, barely visible in the silver backing. Mira Elson. The more he learned about her, the more he realized how much of her life mirrored his. She was quiet. She didn't have many visitors. She complained once to building management about someone watching her through the peephole, but they claimed the hallway security camera never showed anyone. She had started recording audio diaries long before she felt truly unsafe. And toward the end, she stopped labeling the tapes entirely. He had dozens of those now. Raw, chaotic audio, distorted with emotion. Her voice would rise, crack, fall into soft humming or whispering. And sometimes, she spoke in voices that weren't hers. The building's blueprints told a different story than what his apartment physically was. According to the city archives, his unit ended at the kitchen wall. But he had a pantry beyond that wall, and it extended deeper than it should. When he knocked along the back, it echoed differently. Hollow. Like a door. He had tried opening it, once. Only once. The handle burned his hand, not with heat, but with cold so intense it raised blisters. Since then, he avoided it. But every so often, the door creaked open slightly on its own, revealing nothing but blackness inside. He knew something waited beyond it. Something that was trying to come through. Or perhaps it already had. It was around this time that the apartment began changing its layout. Subtly, at first. The kitchen counter shifted a few inches overnight. Then the hallway seemed slightly longer, the bathroom sink further from the door. It wasn't always. Some days, it was normal. Others, it was different. He began leaving tape markings on the floor to measure. Within a week, the dimensions had changed 7 times. On one particular morning, the entrance door had vanished completely, replaced with a blank wall as if the apartment had never intended to let him leave again. Then came the duplication. He awoke to the sound of someone breathing beside his bed. Not in the room, beside him. When he opened his eyes, no one was there. But in the hallway mirror, he saw himself lying still, and another figure watching over him. Not just similar. Identical. A perfect replica of his body, his posture, even his expressions. Except the reflection didn't blink when he did. It smiled when he didn't. He punched the mirror in panic. It didn't shatter. It rippled. Reality was not deteriorating. It was being rewritten. And he wasn't the author. He could no longer trust his own memories. Every detail from his past started to blur and warp, slipping like water through fingers grasping at truth. Faces of old friends he was certain he knew faded into strangers when he tried to recall them. Names became jumbled. Even the simplest facts about his life were suspect. The tapes played over and over in his mind, their cryptic whispers contaminating every waking thought. The recordings were no longer confined to the small cassette player or the handful of physical tapes he found under the floorboards. Voices leaked into his dreams, bleeding into the silence of his mind at odd hours. They promised revelations, offered fragments of explanations that vanished when daylight came. At times, the woman's voice echoed in his head, urgent and pleading, "Remember me. Find me." He tried to piece together the connection between himself and Mira Elson. It wasn't just the apartment, the haunting, or the stalker's obsession. Something deeper tied them together, something that made his life feel like a repeat performance of a tragedy long past. He began obsessively researching Myra's life, her background, her final days. Newspaper archives, court records, police reports, none of it painted a clear picture. Her death was an open wound in the building's history, but the details were either vague or contradictory. Officially, Mira Elson was found dead inside her apartment, locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. No obvious cause of death. Her phone lines were cut. Her windows sealed shut. The building's residents whispered rumors, a suicide, a domestic dispute gone wrong, or a disappearance cloaked in secrecy. The police files contained missing pages, redacted lines, and unexplained inconsistencies. Why had her stalker never been caught? Why did the investigation stall so abruptly? He wondered if the stalker was still out there. Watching. Waiting. That thought sent chills through him every time the footsteps started again above his ceiling. Not random noises, deliberate, paced, a slow and careful stalking of a ghost. The crying too, it never stopped. It was no longer just sorrow. It was warning. It was accusation. And then came the days when he heard breathing through the vents, slow and steady, as if someone invisible was sharing the same air. He tried to rationalize it. Air ducts, city noise, old pipes creaking. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was being hunted. The paranoia grew. His reflection in the mirror wasn't always his own. Sometimes, the eyes staring back were hollow, lifeless. Other times, they glowed with a faint unnatural light, as if the glass was a gateway. He stopped looking at mirrors altogether. Neighbors stopped answering his knocks. The doorman gave him wary looks, as if he sensed something unnatural clinging to the man who once seemed ordinary. Friends drifted away, unable to explain why they couldn't reach him, why calls went unanswered, why texts returned unread. He didn't blame them. How could they understand when he barely understood himself? Sleep became a battlefield. He was trapped in a nightmare from which he could not awaken. The lines between reality and dream blurred into a fog of confusion and fear. The tapes sometimes played in his sleep, louder and clearer than ever, drowning out even the pounding of his heart. The voices sometimes turned to screams, other times to silence so absolute it threatened to swallow him whole. One night, he found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the pantry door, the one that burned his hand when he tried to open it before. This time, the door was slightly ajar. A faint light spilled from the crack, inviting and menacing all at once. Compelled by something beyond reason, he reached out and pushed it open. Inside was not the cramped storage space he expected. Instead, an endless hallway stretched before him, walls lined with the peeling wallpaper of a forgotten era. At the end of the corridor, a flickering light revealed a figure seated on a chair. It was a woman, her hair long and tangled, her face obscured by shadows. She was humming a lullaby he recognized from the tapes, the same haunting melody that had echoed through his apartment for weeks. As he stepped forward, the woman slowly lifted her head. The face was unmistakable. It was Mira Elson. Her eyes were wide and filled with terror. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice trembling. "He's still watching. He never left." Before he could speak, the walls began to pulse, the floor beneath him trembling as if the building itself was alive and warning him to flee. The light flickered violently, and a cold wind howled through the corridor, carrying with it the faint sound of footsteps and crying. The woman reached out a pale hand, trembling, and placed it over his heart. "Find the tapes," she said, "or he will never stop." Suddenly, the hallway collapsed into darkness, and he was back in his apartment, the pantry door firmly closed. But in his hand, he now held a tape, one he was certain hadn't been there before. The label read simply, "For you." That tape was different. It wasn't a confession, or a recording of fear. It was a message. A warning. A promise. The stalker wasn't just a shadow of the past. He was still here, still hunting. And the cycle was far from over. The tape hissed to life in the silence of the room, crackling like a dying ember struggling to stay alive. A voice, low and distorted, began to speak, familiar yet chilling. It was not Myra's voice, but something colder, darker, layered with menace and a kind of perverse satisfaction. "You think this is over?" the voice sneered. "You're trapped. Just like her. Just like all the others. The words settled heavily in the air, embedding themselves in his mind like a poison. Trapped. The word echoed endlessly, a cruel reminder of the fate that had claimed Mira, and now threatened to claim him. He played the tape again, desperate to catch every syllable, every hidden meaning. The stalker's voice revealed fragments of his obsession, how he had watched Mira, studied her, learned her routines, her fears, and her secrets. He spoke of control, of possession, of the sickness that drove him to silence her forever. And then came the final revelation: the stalker had never left the building. He had stayed, lurking in the shadows, adapting, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. And now, that chapter was his. The apartment above wasn't empty. It was a prison. A trap. A stage set for a performance no one else could see, but he was the unwilling lead. The stalker had orchestrated everything: the footsteps, the crying, the whispers in the vents. They were all meant to break him down, to wear away at his sanity until he was as lost and vulnerable as Mira had been. He realized then that the tapes under his floorboards weren't just recordings. They were breadcrumbs, left by Mira as a desperate attempt to reach someone who could finish what she couldn't. To expose the stalker's madness and end the cycle of silence and fear. But the stalker wasn't just watching from a distance anymore. He was closer than he ever imagined. The footsteps, the breathing, the faint reflections in the mirror, they were all signs of his presence. Sometimes, he felt cold fingers brush his skin in the dead of night. Sometimes, objects moved without explanation, subtle but deliberate reminders that he was never alone. The paranoia had consumed him, but it was grounded in terrifying reality. He reached for the phone, dialing the police with trembling fingers. He wanted to tell them everything, to finally end the nightmare. But the line was dead, just like Myra's had been. No dial tone, no connection, just silence. Panic surged through him. The stalker was cutting off his lifelines, isolating him, just as he had done before. The walls of his reality were closing in, tighter and tighter. He remembered the little journal Mira had kept, its pages filled with frantic handwriting, warnings, names, dates, and cryptic codes. He flipped through it once more, searching for a clue, a way out. Then he found it, a name, scribbled in bold letters: Julian Kane. The same name that had appeared in the tapes, the news reports, and the fleeting glimpses of his own fading memory. Julian Kane was the stalker. The man who had haunted Myra's last days, and now haunted his. But who was Julian Kane? Was he a ghost? A deranged neighbor? Or something worse? Desperation pushed him to dig deeper, using every ounce of his fading strength to uncover the truth. He discovered a hidden file buried in old police records, an unsolved missing persons case tied to Julian Kane. The man had disappeared shortly after Myra's death, but witnesses claimed to have seen him lurking around the building long after, a shadow slipping through hallways, a figure that never truly left. The realization hit him with brutal clarity: the stalker was still alive. Or something pretending to be. He wasn't just a victim. He was part of a twisted ritual, a repeating nightmare where time folded back on itself, trapping everyone in a loop of horror and silence. And worse, the stalker's gaze was fixed firmly on him. The footsteps grew louder that night, no longer tentative but deliberate, echoing through the ceiling like a march of doom. The crying escalated, becoming a wail that clawed at his sanity. He felt the presence closing in, suffocating. There was only one choice left. He had to confront the stalker. Armed with the tapes, Myra's journal, and a resolve forged in fear and desperation, he climbed the creaking stairs to the silent apartment above, the place where the nightmare had begun and where it had to end. The door, once sealed for 12 years, was ajar. He pushed it open, stepping into a room frozen in time. Dust particles danced in the thin shafts of moonlight, and the faint scent of old paper and decay filled the air. In the center of the room stood a figure, tall and shadowed, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Julian Kane. The stalker smiled, a cold and twisted expression. "You came. Just like she did." "No more silence," he whispered. "This ends now." What followed was a confrontation not just of bodies but of wills, a battle between light and shadow, sanity and madness. The stalker's grip on reality was fragile but dangerous, fueled by years of obsession and rage. As the night stretched on, the building seemed to pulse with their struggle. The walls whispered secrets, the floor trembled beneath their feet, and the crying ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. When dawn finally broke, the silent apartment above was empty. No footsteps. No cries. No shadows. He was alone, but free. Outside, the city awoke, indifferent to the horrors hidden within its walls. But inside him, a fragile peace settled, the knowledge that some stories, no matter how dark, could be faced and survived. And as he left the building behind, he knew one thing for certain. The silent apartment above would never be silent again, not because of fear, but because the truth had finally found its voice. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey through the silent apartment above. If this story sent shivers down your spine or left you questioning what hides behind closed doors, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime and psychological horror. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in your own home? Or maybe you know a story that's been buried in silence. I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might just inspire our next video. Remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones we see, but the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for their next victim. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and keep your eyes open, because in this world, silence doesn't always mean peace. This is Dark Nights, signing off.